But what have you got? Matt gazed greedily into his brother's hand. Nick was weaker in the counting, and so was still moving his lips over the coins. 33. Finally, he answered cheerfully. I got 52, Matt said. That adds up to 85. That's enough, Nick asked hopefully. I don't know, the older man shrugged. But when we were walking by yesterday, I looked at the window, and it said that in honor of the holiday discounts on bouquets. Nick, who always marveled at his brother's ingenuity, said excitedly. Outside the window of a small apartment in an old 5-story building, the sun was shining, and there was not a cloud in the sky. Such wonderful weather stood for a day, which, coupled with the abnormally high air temperature for March, led to the fact that as the time moved towards International Women's Day, there was almost no snow left on the streets of the city, and the vegetation even began to swell, greenish in buds. The weather. Nick and Matt sat in their room and counted the contents of their emptied piggy banks. It was customary for their little family's piggy banks to be filled once a week after Mom came home before the weekend, and usually had a little change from what she had left over after going into the store. Natalie just thought that pocket money was important for kids because it taught them the value of money, and besides, you can keep them busy with difficult choices. What should I spend it on? To buy gum today or tomorrow when they go for a walk in the park on Sunday, to eat ice cream or a hot donut with jelly. Now Matt and Nick were 8 and 7 years old, respectively, with first grade looming for the fall. As for the piggy banks, which were one for each brother, their current contents had accumulated for 3 whole months. Because the small family was quite tight with money, it was because Natalia had been fired from the bookstore where she had worked for a long time, and now she had to find a new job, of course, because her savings were melting away. So you have 2 children. As soon as at the interview, for example, in the supermarket for the vacancy, cashier sounded this phrase, with slight variations, but one meaning always, Natalie tensed, because it meant one thing in communication with a specialist from the Human Resources Department. She now walks on the edge, because no one liked the fact that the potential employee had difficult family circumstances, that the potential employee would take a sick leave, and 1,000 other reasons to go away. After all, Natalie, in principle not accustomed to lying, honestly said that yes, she has no husband, and no relatives do not help to raise children. They live on their own with their small family. So it turned out that the current situation of Natalie, Nick, and Matt as if hinted that soon someone would be completely poor. But Natalie tried to hold on and not descend into despair, but it wasn't easy. After all, she had to pay off debts on utility bills, and her brothers had a pneumonia in winter, and the doctor prescribed a long course of expensive vitamins. And they grew up, naturally, like all kids, so they had to buy new clothes for spring. The family was orphaned, left without the main breadwinner defender, and most importantly, without a dear loved one. A little over a year ago, he was just going to work in the morning and stopped at an intersection to wait for a green light. And there was some rich kid coming back from a club at 7 o'clock in the morning. He was, as they found out later, drunk, had taken some nasty stuff at the club, and on the corner he lost control. The car flew into a bus stop. Everyone managed to bounce out of the way except Chris. The major, he died on the spot too. His family, by the way, didn't even bother to offer moral compensation. They were generally dismissive of other people's grief. We'll have to think of something. Matt sighed. Mom's so sad. We have to make her happy. He waved his hands. How about we sell something? Nick asked. No, we need everything ourselves. But I'll think of something, Matt said stubbornly. There was a rustling in the hallway. That's Mom walking in there. Let's clean it up, Matt told his brother. And they began to put the coins back in the cracks. On the backs of the porcelain sninkies, the piggy banks were modern. No need to break to get to the contents. There's a plastic flap at the bottom. You're not dressed yet, asked her mother, peering into the room. We need help. We quickly scooped up Matt. No, we don't. What are we, little? Natalie, nodding, shut the door back. But stop it, Matt told his brother, because Nick's lips quivered. He always cringed somehow when Mom dressed in all black and tied a black shawl on her head. That's how she looked at the funeral of her husband and the father of her children. That's how she looked every time they went to the cemetery once a month. It took a long time to get to that eternal last refuge. on 2 buses, streetcars, and shuttles across town. And no matter how little money there was in the family, Natalie always found a couple hundred for fresh flowers. She took great care to keep everything nice and clean and neat. We were the only ones left. Natalie said quietly and stroked her youngest son's head. "We are orphans." She always said something sad on the road. Nick roared at first, then he got used to it and just sniffled tensely. Matt looked at his brother in a pathetic and patronizing way. He took him firmly by the paw when they got off at the last stop. In general, Matt began to think a lot about life for an 8-year-old. As he got off, thoughts came. He, figuratively speaking, looked at them from all sides, evaluated them, and figured out how they could be applied to real life or they would remain purely in his head. And lately, Matt had been particularly concerned with the future of his family. He wondered more and more if his mom would get married, because he knew it happens. And even some adults say it's necessary to have a man in the house. An example for the sons of a master. True, Matt did not share such views. Why do they need a hypothetical man in the house? Especially if he looks like Uncle Tom, a former colleague of Dad, who works in the same car service. He's been dropping by more and more lately. Sometimes he'd stay for lunch or dinner and compliment Natalie on what a great cook she was. A couple of times he brought his brother's toys, plastic cars, which are cheaper than a loaf of bread. You can buy at roadside stands. "Do you miss your father?" Uncle Tom liked to ask. Matt would hit him for it, because Nick would start crying. But Uncle Tom, it was like he was happy to see a child cry. And he'd get on his nerves and tell him a man shouldn't cry. They obviously lacked a serious upbringing. And so, apart from Uncle Tom, there were almost no guests in their house. Those grandparents who were mom and dad to Natalie were known to the brothers only from photos, died of a stroke one after another before they were born. And those grandparents who were mom and dad to Chris were alive, but didn't want to know their grandchildren because they were against the marriage from the beginning. Nick was lucky enough not to be foolishly naive about it. But Matt, from a casual conversation, realized that these people think badly of their mother. They think that their daddy is not their own, that Natalie turned them on somewhere on the side she walked. Matt was sick of hearing that, so he didn't need those grandparents, and he hadn't witnessed the scene when those people called, by the way. Natalie, after Chris died, and offered to do a genetic test for parentage. They made it a condition. They said that then they would help to raise the children financially. Natalie, insulted, refused to do so, and all contacts with relatives were cut off. When they visited the cemetery, the first few times Nick sobbed with his mother, but not just because he missed his dad very much too. He was scared. Matt wished he'd had time to hit that on. It was some distant relative who had scared his little brother at the funeral, saying that there were dead people everywhere sleeping. But if little kids mess around here, they'll come up, grab them, and drag them underground with them. Mom, of course, calmed me down. Nneka said it never happens. But for how long were logical explanations enough for the nun, even though they were yearlings? Matt considered himself not just the older, but a much more seriously intelligent man, and generally treated his brother patronizingly. Now he and Nick were standing quietly, and Mom was crying, sobbing bitterly, and asking someone unseen. Why was she being treated like this? What had she done to deserve such grief? I'm hungry, Nick reported. Matt sighed. They weren't starving, but lately, they had mostly potatoes, pasta, and bread on the table, and sometimes a little fruit in season. Mom also bought soups and chicken kits and canned goods. Then, of course, we ate at daycare. But Nick, who was a terrible delicacy, constantly complained about hunger. But it's good that only to him, to his brother, and he didn't pester his mother. How could she bear it, poor thing? The brothers did not notice how a man suddenly approached them. In general, the cemetery was not very crowded that day. And here, as if from under the ground, this old woman, also all in black, grew up. She was so small and puny that she seemed to be carried away by the wind. She came up to them and stopped beside them. Natalie continued to sob. The brothers looked at their grandmother in bewilderment. "Chris's wife, then," she said, wishing with her lips. "Excuse me, who are you?" Natalie, finally noticing her, turned around, wiping her tears. "I say, you, Chris's widow?" "Yes," nodded the woman. "And you are?" "Margaret, I'm his teacher." Natalie frowned. It was natural that there had been teachers in her husband's life, but she hadn't personally heard of any Margaret and couldn't recall the old woman at the funeral. You go to him too, yes, said Natalie, implying that the old woman had apparently come to this sad place for the same reason she had. No, I go to my husband's, answered the grandmother, and I visit him. He was a good Chris Smart. I remember, first in my class. What did you teach? Geography and summer camp. Natalie gasped. She suddenly realized who she was looking at. Of course, her husband had told this story many times when he was 12 years old, when he went to summer camp and got lost in the woods and was severely stung by bees. And Margaret, for the summer moonlighting educator, not only competently rendered first aid, but while lying Chris in the infirmary, visited him every day cared for. His own parents did not come to the boy, referring to the great business, but as Chris told me, he suspected that they didn't really care. It wasn't like their son was left with an invalid, so there was no need to travel. Anyway, Chris remembered Margaret with great warmth, but as I recall now Natalie, he had not seen her once since he returned from the camp. She had quit school and gone somewhere else. They barely kept in touch, and now, after all these years, she found him in real life. And it turns out she was too late. Nor did she see her former student while he was alive. In that case, the whole story was turning out to be very bitter. And so Natalie stood there at a loss as to what to say and how to say it. Here she should deal with her own thoughts and feelings, as they say, and not listen to another person. But I didn't want to be callous, indifferent, without feelings. Chris is gone, Margaret said. Gone, son? Natalie sighed. It became even heavier that here was an elderly man talking before her eyes. After all, Margaret calling Chris her son was absurd. He had a completely different mother. For a while, the two adults and the two children just stood silently by the bed, looking at the monument. In the distance, some birds were still hovering. The sun was shining clearly. You are poor? Asked the old woman and looked closely. No, we are fine, replied Natalie. She suddenly held out a fist to the old woman. I'm sorry. Natalie even stepped back. Not at all. Take it while it lasts. Granny was quick. She grabbed Natalie's hand and put something in her palm. Her fingers clenched in a bunch, and she bounced off to the side and without saying goodbye, almost ran through the cemetery, somewhere in the direction of the gate. Mom, what did she want? Nick pulled Natalie's skirt. I don't know, the widow muttered confusedly. And then she carefully dropped her hand, as if she feared that the strange old woman might have left something evil there. On her hand lay a silver pendant in the shape of the constellation of the Great Bear. Fine lacework stars connected by thin chains were studded with transparent stones, drops of cassock. It was a luxurious yet elegant beauty. Mom, what is it? Matt asked. A piece of jewelry, Nick answered. Mom, why did the old lady give it to you? I don't know, said Natalie confusedly. Once more he looked around, but the strange Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Let's go, she said. She looked sadly at the monument on her husband's grave, and then, taking the children by the hands, she left the cemetery. When the family returned home, they were waiting for the usual hassle of preparing dinner, then still the laundry to unload, and also had to sort through the fall leaves that the boys had collected in the square near the house. They wanted to make a herbarium, and although Natalie was not to herbarium, she was in a heavy dusty apathy for the last few days, but she could not refuse her sons. In the evening, when the boys had gone to bed, Natalie remembered the old woman and the pendant. She had the impression that the grandmother might not have her head on straight. Why would she give her former student's wife such a thing? Well, the morning is wiser, Natalie decided, and put the thing on the shelf of the secretary behind the model sailboat. Chris assembled it and the kids helped. Finally went to bed. Ordinarily, Natalie slept without words. In principle, something appeared to her in the night. But they were chaotic and confusing passages that had something to do with reality. For example, she could recalculate the change in the store in her sleep, because it seems that they counted the purchases incorrectly. Or she could take an interminably long time to climb the stairs because the elevator broke and wonder where her floor was. But on this night, Natalie dreamed something extraordinary. She was standing in the middle of an extreme snowfield. In the blue sky scattered myriads of stars, danced multicolored flashes, northern lights. And although Natalie was dressed in a pink summer sundress and was barefoot, she was not cold. She felt so good in her dream that the northern lights were singing, as if they were the sound of magical violins and flutes, whose melody penetrated her heart, sheltering her from all the worries of the world. In her dream, she distantly remembered that somewhere out there beyond the snowy, boundless desert, she still had children, but she suddenly became indifferent to it, that they were blind kittens who could not grow up without their mother, would live alone, and she was fine here. So good that she would probably stay here forever. Don't. Suddenly, a soft, velvety voice sounded behind her. Natalie turned around and gasped in amazement. Standing in front of her was a polar bear, a huge furry one with stray eyes. Don't, he repeated and shifted out of the plush, stepping closer to her. You have to be alive and you can't stay here. Something in Natalie's heart snapped and she felt a searing pain, but it wasn't bodily, it was her soul, the sorrow of losing her husband, the fear that she wouldn't be able to take care of her children. She felt sick, and she knew who was to blame. Suddenly, she held a trident like the one used to represent Poseidon, the god of the seas. Natalie shook it tightly and pointed the point at the bear. "Stay back," she exclaimed. "Is this all your fault?" "No," replied Mishka and fearlessly stepped closer. "It's the weather, and it's up to you to decide what to do next." Natalie frowned. What was he talking about? And then she realized, indeed, the weather had turned bad. Now she felt the cold and the northern lights were gone from the sky and the stars were out. And all around her a blizzard was blowing long and every tiny particle of snow cut painfully like glass. Tears flowed from Natalie's eyes and immediately began to freeze into ice on her face. "Leave me alone," she shouted to the bear and swung her trident at him. He stepped forward, she wounded him, but he seemed to have to go back anyway. As if he were a disobedient child, he exhorted her. "You can't stay here." Natalie shook her head desperately. No, she couldn't go back. There she would be overwhelmed again with worries, responsibilities, fears, pain, loss, fatigue. And here she would simply lie down and sleep, and let the snowstorm sing her lullaby forever. "No, I'm not leaving," said, as if the bear had read her thoughts, and stepped closer again. The trident fell out of Natalie's hands, and she weakly began to fall backwards, but did not fall. She was picked up by huge, soft paws. Warm, fluffy fur covered her with a blanket, and then Natalie woke up, jumped up sitting up on the bed and lingered. "Where's what? Ah, she's home. It was just a dream." "One can only dream such nonsense," sighed the woman. After breakfast, at which, naturally, the sons were again capricious, about the fact that the omelet is slippery and porridge with points. Natalie took them to the kindergarten. There, it was not without exchanging a few phrases with other moms and even one dad. In general, with all the people who brought the kids here. And although it was only March, they were only talking about the upcoming summer, when they had to take the kids out of town, and about the upcoming September. It was the first school year for many of the kids in Matt Nick's group. Coming out of kindergarten, Natalie was completely sad. Her crumbs, no summer vacation, neither on the sea, not in the camp, nor in the village, also does not shine. And that until September 1, it generally frightened her. It was necessary to buy textbooks, stationery, new clothes, and it all promised to come out in so much money. And also, probably, the school would start to collect money for teachers' holidays and excursions. Natalie was already thinking straight, how she and her little ones would be treated, considering they'd probably be the poorest in the class, maybe in the whole school. And of course, there was nothing to think about hiring her sons a tutor to help them prepare for first grade. Nothing. Natalie tried to cheer herself up. It used to be to school through the forest with wolves and one teacher for the whole village. And nothing. They grew up educated people. Further on in the schedule of the day, there were 2 interviews. At the first, Natalie barely voiced that she was a single mother. She was immediately told she wasn't hired. "But I put that on my resume," she protested. "You're wasting my time." Elsewhere, it was like everything was fine. And Natalie even allowed herself a little hope, fell down on some stupid test about zodiac signs, teacups, and pencils. Walking outside, she almost cried. Why can't a person just get a job normally? After all, she is neat, not confrontational, without bad habits, and even knows French. Really, what does the latter matter to a salesman? Still, it was very frustrating. The mood was somewhere below the level of the Mariana Trench, and even the sun was not happy. Natalie wandered slowly down the street. What to make for dinner? Cutlets. There was still ground beef left in the freezer. The main thing to add more bread and can still scroll vegetables. Apparently, only secretly can make her boys eat broccoli, beans, cauliflower, and all other healthy. Walking down the street, Natalie passed a jewelry store. There were a couple of saleswomen standing on the porch of this boutique, and a snippet of their conversation reached Natalie. Of course, he had his own progressive views, but this new interview format kicked out mockingly. One of them. And don't tell me, the other one supported her. Can you imagine? I was told already that I may not even try. Because, you see, not enough arrow-fu. What stupid words. Anyway, he'll be looking for a sales girl for a long time. Yes, the first one laughed. Then he'll look for some professor's grandmother. Natalie slowed down a little. The jewelry store needs a salesman. She's a fool, though. She'd heard what they were saying. Apparently, the owner of this jewelry boutique is very serious about choosing candidates, and he certainly doesn't want a single mom. So enough of this nonsense. There's another place to try and get in. Roadside stands for candy bars and such. They needed a salesman, but they'd already scared me in advance that the schedule is variable and there may be night shifts. Natalie was crossing the road when she was thinking, and although she was usually a very attentive pedestrian, now she didn't notice how she ran the red light. "Woman, where are you standing?" She was belatedly called out by one of the people standing near the traffic light. There was a shrill squeal of brakes. Everything was decided in a matter of moments and centimeters. The hood of a red sports car literally jabbed into Natalie's legs, causing her to stagger and swing her arms ridiculously. Then she leaned on it to keep her balance, breathing heavily. The driver's door slammed shut. "You're crazy?" raged a young, blonde-haired man in a dark business suit. "What the hell are you doing?" "What am I doing?" Natalie, who was having a hard time thinking straight, said absent-mindedly, "I'm sorry." She whispered and swayed and stepped aside. Her head was buzzing. Dark flickers flashed before her eyes. A car hit. Her husband hit by a car. It had all been about the same. And now she was almost being victimized. Yes, it suddenly began to dawn on Natalie that if it hadn't been an accident, her children might have been orphans by now. Chris had died because another man had broken the rules of the road, and now she was out on the roadway by herself. The situations are similar and yet opposite. At this point, Natalie's nerves gave out and she burst into loud tears. She cried ugly, choking on her tears, barely catching air. She was barely aware of what was going on around her. Just reached the sidewalk and stood leaning against a pole. She almost hung on it, wrapping her arms around it. The driver of the red car quietly got behind the wheel and quickly drove smoothly to the curb, slowed down and got out again. He approached Natalie. "Woman, are you feeling ill?" "Of course I'm sick." Some lady in a beret answered him. "You hit her." "Why would you lie?" A man with a check bag on wheels stepped in. "No, I didn't. She ran the red light herself and wasn't hurt at all. She was just scared." Natalie, meanwhile, continued to flounder in her hysterics and couldn't stop. She could hear the stranger asking her what was wrong through a layer of absorbent cotton. She could hear him telling her to sit down. And then she went with him like a wind-up doll when he put his arm around her shoulders and led her to a place where she could actually sit down. There was a cafe a stone's throw away. A bus pulled up, with people waiting at the stop. A woman in a beret, a man with a bag and other witnesses of the incident began to climb into it. And beautifully said, a middle-aged woman in a green coat. As in the TV series They Met by Chance, and he is a millionaire in a red car. Then the bus moved off, and everyone who witnessed this scene very quickly and forgot, because in fact, nothing tragic happened, and everyone had their own lives and concerns. "I'm sorry," Natalie muttered. She was sitting at the cafe table. She had already drunk a glass of water brought by the waitress, a girl, and now she was warming her cold hands and her lats. "I don't know what came over me." "Stop apologizing," said the blonde man sitting across from me. "It's not your fault, is it? It's just that everyone reacts differently to stress." "My husband died the same way," Natalie said, suddenly, and bit his lip. She wasn't used to complaining to strangers and didn't like it. But here the words seemed to come by themselves. She said a few more words, apologized again, and looked away from the coffee in just those few moments. As she looked out the window, the coffee house was enough for the man's face to change. It was like a shadow ran across it, but he immediately pulled himself together and looked calm and collected again, generally giving away nothing of his reaction to her words. Natalie assured him that she didn't need to go to the hospital because she'd only have a bruise on her knee. "Oh, I'm late," she exclaimed and fussed. "I have a job interview. Can I let you down?" he asked. "No, don't worry," waved Natalie away and fumbled embarrassedly in her purse. Still had to pay for this cup of coffee. "I'm paying decisively," he said, and before she would have collected the bills with change, attached a card dress of a new color to the True Waitress terminal. "This way I can let you down, at least somehow compensate for my fault. I should have been more careful on the road after all." Natalie hesitated. Should she take the job or not? She really wanted the job. The money was almost zero, so she nodded. It was a short drive of about 5 minutes, so she had time. The stranger introduced himself as Alex. She said her name. A few easy phrases. Natalie said she was looking for a sales job now, and she had a degree in economics. "Why not in the office then, or as a store manager?" Alex asked. "Yes, it just so happened," shrugged his shoulders. "I was already pregnant in my last year of study and decided that when I got out of maternity leave, I would look for a good place." And then Natalie told me what happened. In the store near home, work suited her more on the schedule and loyalty to the 7 urgent absences than in the company, to which was to drive another 5 stops. And then the second pregnancy happened. And when the youngest was born, she and her husband decided that, with his good salary, it would be enough for the family, and she could continue working as a salesman. It would be convenient. The schedule 2 after 2 and everything else. It was very satisfying. And now it turns out that again the salesman is the best option because, well, what kind of office career is she now? And it seems to me you with your experience and erudite could find a better place than in a kiosk at the bus stop, said Alex. "Oh, behind Katla eyes Natalie don't. You have no idea. But here too, if they take it, it'll be a miracle. You know," he said thoughtfully, "I'd just like to make a suggestion." "What?" Natalie was boring in her purse, her ringtone playing. "It's just that I have a sales position open right now," Alex said. "The Queen's Diamond Jewelry Store." She'd heard of it. It was a very expensive and high-end place. She'd walked right past it the other day. "You're kidding." Natalie deflected the challenge. It was Tom, and he could definitely wait. And anyway, Natalie wasn't sure she was ready to talk to him right now. The man had come to visit her yesterday, as usual, but he'd been drunk. He'd made some stupid claims. And it got to the point where she pushed him out onto the landing, afraid of his anger. And even though he's probably sobered up by now, Natalie didn't want to talk to him. "Why not?" "Just kidding." Alex gave her an attentive look. "Where am I and where is the jewelry boutique?" Natalie waved her hands. "I have no experience with jewelry or with your customers in general." "What about them?" "With customers?" Alex asked with a smile. "You know," shrugged Natalie, probably you need a special approach, knowing some etiquette and all that." "You are charming," Alex laughed. And Natalie bit her lip nervously. His laughter affected her strangely, sending clusters of goosebumps along her spine. Pleasant ones. Our clients are actually the most ordinary people. They just have money, and they're used to getting better from the product to the service itself. And yes, I can tell you exactly why I'm offering this to you. You, Natalie, not only have the proper education and experience, albeit in the marketplace and in simple places, but you have something equally valuable. He was silent for a while, obviously thinking about something, then continued. You have a literate, pleasant speech. You give the impression of an intelligent man. And I'm sorry, you are certainly not one of those women who in every client, no matter whether single or wearing a wedding ring, see a potential daddy. And pardon me for being blunt, you don't disgrace my establishment with your pathetic attempts at dating. Natalie was a little shocked because it was too good. It turns out she met the owner of the high-end jewelry salon himself. And after she herself, in fact, ran into his car, he did not scold her and drove away, but also gave her coffee, listened to her whining, and then offered her a ride and now offered to go to work for him. "I'll think about it," finally Natalie said. but I just want it right away. You want to warn me that you can expect anything from a single mom with 2 kids, he grinned. Believe me, I can imagine how hard it is. I mean, my sister got divorced recently, and she's got 2 twin daughters in daycare, and she doesn't have time for anything. Natalie did a pertinent but not polite remark that it's wrong to compare the problems and opportunities of a single mom who is the most ordinary woman and the one who is the sister of a millionaire. She only nodded and said she could send him a resume in that case. Alex said that the interview was, in fact, already underway, and added that if she wanted, she could go to work even tomorrow. Thank you, Natalie said. Stop right there, please. There's one more place I have to go. A market stall. Alex raised his eyebrows. Yes, I have a job interview at the stall, with dignity, said Natalie. First of all, I got here before I got here with you. And secondly, it's just nice to have a choice, you know? I do, and I find it worthy of respect. Alex answered seriously. Wait, he called out when she got out of the car. We haven't exchanged phone numbers, and then I can wait for you and take you home. No, thank you. You've already done a lot. The woman smiled. I still have to go to the store and pick up my sons from daycare. Goodbye, Alex. She waved him off. See you later, he replied. And he gave her a thoughtful look. What bizarre turns fate sometimes makes. Alex thought, how did it happen that he met this woman, and under such particular circumstances it was so strange? But she seemed to him unique, extraordinary. As soon as he saw her frightened, confused near his car. And then, oh, why her? Why is this her story? Grim, bitter, cruel, and nightmarishly intertwined with his family's story. What's he supposed to do with all this? And the big question is how to tell her the truth or not. But then what would happen when she found out? Getting out quietly, Alex twisted the steering wheel and, having waited from the car the maximum speed allowed, rushed through the city. He had a lot more to do for today. The rest of the day, which pleased and calmed, was life-expanding. Natalie's nerves had passed quietly and without any miscellaneous such and such surprises. She'd even been lucky enough to buy fish at a discount, so it was fried fish for dinner, not cutlets. She dialed Tom herself and told him they should probably take a break from talking. He began to whine that he wouldn't drink anymore, that it was all so random, and Natalie sighed and forgave him. From the kindergarten together with her sons, she took the news that the holiday on March 8 will be a matinee and all the children will prepare gifts for their mothers. The teachers decided that the best thing to do would be crafts made of paper, flowers, something made of plasticine, and we could also draw pictures. Natalie made a note in her notebook where she wrote down everything about the family budget, to buy colored paper or watercolor paints. Both would be expensive, and it was quite evening before she remembered the jewelry that this strange old lady Margaret had passed on to her. Natalie twirled it around in her hands again. It was beautiful, and maybe, if not costume jewelry, even expensive. She decided, no, it must be returned, and what would do that? She dialed her mother-in-law's number for starters. I'm not asking for money, hastily announced her intentions to Natalie, so as not to be thrown from the other side of the phone. When asked if she knew anything about one of her son's teachers, the mother-in-law gave a predictable answer. No, because why would she even want to know? But then she sighed and said she remembered a certain Margaret. Wait, said the mother-in-law, and leaving the phone on the line, went somewhere to the side. For half an hour, Natalie listened to the rustling. Then the mother-in-law said that apparently Chris sometimes wrote letters to this Margaret. She found her address in her son's old notebook and dictated it. Thank you, Natalie said. She wouldn't call, wouldn't get in touch with her mother-in-law, but it so happened that after her husband's death, almost all of his belongings, toys, children's diaries, mother-in-law took for himself. And Natalie didn't mind. They were his parents after all. After reading the address, Natalie realized that Margaret didn't live very far away, so she could go to her tomorrow. Of course, it would be better to call first, but a phone was definitely impossible to get. The next day morning, Natalie found a message from Alex on her smartphone. Received. Smiling, she wrote back, "No, so I can send a resume." A minute later, he replied, "And I've accepted. When to wait?" "Tomorrow, if possible. What time should I come over?" Natalie asked. And he answered that by 9 he will be at the salon, and personally familiarize her with all the specifics of the work. They talked details and signed the papers. At the right address, where Natalie went immediately after taking the children to kindergarten, there was a typical panel 9-story building. The yard in front of it was planted with poplars, which, judging by the thickness of the trunk, were at least 50 years old. There were flower beds under the windows of the first floors. And although it was too early for full blooming, in some places primroses were already sticking. And the whole picture suggested to Natasha that it could be incredibly beautiful here in summer. And on the bench at the entrance, where, according to the sign, the right apartment was located, sat the ubiquitous grandmothers. Natalie decided to address them. "Excuse me, could you tell me if Margaret lives here?" "Margaret, that's interesting." One of the old ladies looked at her. "She's been here about 100 years. Are you from Social Security?" Another grandmother asked, and before Natalie could answer, she splashed her hands. "It's about time, or they'll torture the poor woman to death." "Torture who?" asked Natalie. "Her daughter-in-law." A third old woman joined the conversation. "Her adopted son ran away from them. I mean that he goes to work on a shift, earns money, and drinks it all there, so he doesn't come home, and he doesn't care about his mother." The grandmother who had answered Natasha first added her own note to the general story, and then from what these old ladies were saying, the whole approximate picture of Margaret's difficult life became clear to Natalie. She had a late and unsuccessful marriage in her life, in which she was womanly ill and unable to give birth herself. She adopted a boy from an orphanage. Her husband at first supported the idea, but then changed his mind and ran away, so Margaret raised her son alone. Then the son got married and family relations finally went to pieces. Daughter-in-law did not put in anything mother-in-law and in general hated her presence. The situation, by the way, aggravated by the fact that Margaret began to have mental problems. She wasn't crazy, but sometimes she could go for a walk in the city and get lost. Sometimes she would start catching neighbors and passersby to talk to them about the distant past, to pour out her soul about the problems of her youth. All in all, it wasn't easy. "What's your business?" Finally, Natalie was asked. "My husband was once a student of Margaret's." She decided to answer as honestly as possible, but without details. "She and I met by chance in the cemetery at his grave. So I decided to visit her one day. They were good friends, I think. After he graduated from high school." Finally, Natalie stepped into the entryway, took the elevator to the 5th floor, and pressed the bell button with trepidation. If everything she'd been told about Margaret's sister-in-law Elizabeth was true, this meeting promised to be anything but pleasant. "What do you want?" A woman in a colored robe opened the door. "Hello, excuse me please." Natalie sucked in a little more air. That was a problem, by the way. Elizabeth reeked of onions and what didn't seem like fresh fish. Natalie tried to spell out in a cursory manner that she needed to see Margaret because she was her deceased husband's teacher. Met her at the cemetery. "And what?" Elizabeth interrupted her. "What do you want?" "Can I talk to her?" Natalie gave her a friendly smile. "It's private." Elizabeth glared at her. "You're not a crook, are you? You don't want the old one to sign the apartment over to you or sell her miracle pills." "What are you talking about?" Natalie was indignant. "All right, come on in." With a wave of her hand, Elizabeth stepped aside. The apartment smelled no better than it did on the landing, and even the air seemed to be humid. The bathroom reeked of tortured, not fresh laundry. Natalie was glad she'd skipped breakfast, just a cup of cocoa. "She's out of her mind," Elizabeth said angrily, "always running away from home. What am I supposed to do, chase her all over town? It's high time to put her in an orphanage, and I don't need her. She's nothing to me." Natalie did not say that she, Elizabeth, and Margaret were nobody, and that she should respect her mother-in-law according to the unwritten moral laws, if only because she lived on her property. Those from downstairs, from the bench by the entranceway, enlightened Natasha. And about the fact that Elizabeth, she came from the village to the city and, in fact, had nothing. Until she married Margaret's son, and even now she didn't work. She lived on what her husband transferred from the north before he could drink it. She roars. "She's been sitting up all night." Elizabeth complained. "She's a hysterical old woman who sold her own trash, and now she's bawling." "What garbage?" "I don't know." Elizabeth poked me. I don't go in her room and she's a pigsty. She's all over her stuff. She thinks I want to steal it and sell it. Ha! If only there was something to sell. She'd start running around the apartment like a friar and moaning that I've thrown something away. She throws things away. She just doesn't remember, stupid. So I can talk to Margaret, Natalie said insistently again, sensing that Elizabeth could complain for a long time. Come in. Maybe then she'll calm down and stop whining. Elizabeth waved her hand, pointing to the door, and went into the bathroom. From there came the sound of a glint, something being wiped off by hand. Natalie sighed and knocked. Margaret, she called out. Excuse me, if I may. There was no answer. She waited a moment, then opened the door. She expected to see something even worse than she had already observed in this apartment, long in need of renovation. But to her surprise, the small room was relatively clean and even breathed easier. There was the usual empty old furniture, lace doily bedspreads, pudgy and prehistoric model TV. On another doily stood a radio, on the windowsill a few pots of flowers. On the walls, evoked from the Soviet-era posters about the teaching profession. And then there were books, as there were many of them here. Margaret sat on the neatly made bed and did not immediately pay attention to the guest. On the old woman's lap lay an open photo album. Good afternoon, said Natalie cautiously and stood still. Do you mind if I come in? It's just, you see, you left the cemetery so abruptly and I thought we needed to. Natalie struggled to find the right words and generally felt stupid. You're the one who finally got the old woman's attention. But come on in now that you're here. Would you like some tea? No. Thank you, Natalie replied. She belatedly realized that she had come empty-handed, not a cake for candy. However, the thought of drinking from dishes from the kitchen, which was clearly not Margaret's but Elizabeth's, made her nauseous. All in all, there was no time for tea. In the most delicate terms, Natalie tried to explain to Margaret that, of course, she was very grateful for the gesture, but she unfortunately did not understand why it was given to her. And secondly, she cannot simply accept such a gift. Please take this as yours, she said, holding out the jewelry in the palm of her hand. The old woman looked at it as if she were ready to corn a poisonous spider. This is yours now, she replied, just mysterious, and turned away, again focused on looking at the photo in the album. For a few minutes in the room hung silence, disturbed only by some retro song coming from the radio, singing the delights of conquering the taiga by young people. Natalie pondered whether to leave the jewelry on the dresser, but she thought it would be ugly and insulting. Is that you? She asked, nodding at one of the pictures. It showed a young woman with thick, dark hair pulled back into a boffin style. She was pictured in the park with a bouquet of gladiolus in her hands, looking at the camera and smiling mischievously. Margaret nodded, which could be taken as an affirmative answer. Then suddenly Natalie spoke. Listening to her slender, quiet story, I dared not interrupt it. So much of this past event from the life of one ordinary teacher, believing in love, goodness, and happiness, rose colorfully before her eyes. And it was shocking in terms of the content of which was revealed in full by the end of the story. Margaret came to the city from a large village. She thought she would become a teacher and return there to teach the kids from the families she knew. But it turned out rather predictably. The city surrounded the head of a young girl, and when they began to tell her, say, such talented teachers, we need them ourselves, she decided to stay. And the pedagogical career did not go, but just flew uphill, as they say. And everything was good. Years later, Margaret became a respected teacher. She was held up as an example to many young teachers, and suddenly, out of the blue, love came into Margaret's life. That is, she thought it was love, but for him it was just entertainment, a savory treat on a business trip. And when he left her with a broken heart and a life born under that heart, Margaret was pregnant. And what a blow that was to her. She wasn't going to have children. She hadn't thought about it at all. And she was well into her 30s. What a sudden pregnancy. Some of the few people privy to her secret advised her to terminate the pregnancy. But there were also those who said it was a great crime against one's own soul. And then there could be bad consequences for one's health. But Margaret couldn't become a single mother either. After all, then her reputation as a teacher would be ruined, and she decided to go on a long vacation, ostensibly for family reasons, for a few months in a neighboring town, And then there she gave birth to a child and then abandoned it there. All erased the mistake from her life. That child, which Margaret renounced, was not yet a year old. How she met the man with whom she decided to try again to create a family. But before it turned out that he was not ready, Margaret learned her terrible for a woman diagnosis of infertility, and she considered this disease as a punishment for giving up her firstborn. But life, as they say, went on, and something had to be done about it. That's when she decided to adopt. And then the rest of Margaret's story was already known to Natalie. I sympathize. She squeezed the words out of her mouth. Natalie tried the situation on herself for a moment and was horrified. No, she couldn't do that. But Margaret was a different person. So how could she judge? I guess it's none of her business. Natalie was about to say she sympathized again, and then she was going to give the jewelry back. But Margaret spoke again. I couldn't love him the way I couldn't love my own. He was fed, clothed, and clothed. I never laid a hand on him in my life. But there was no warmth of soul that should be between a mother and a child. Because I looked at my Jack and realized that he was growing up. And there was another person growing up somewhere, the one who was dear to me. So I started looking for him. No one wanted to tell me where he had been taken. No one cared how my motherly heart was hurting. But I still searched for him, and after 10 years I found out the whole truth. My own son was adopted by people from the same town where I lived. From that, yes, I found him. Margaret paused briefly. It was hard to swallow, and she coughed. Natalie handed her a drink of water, a glass and decanter standing nearby on the nightstand. It was evident that the conversation was tiring the older woman, but Natalie did not interrupt her. It was almost an instinctive realization that Margaret was very important and needed to talk about everything and pour out, as they say, her soul, which apparently she hadn't been able to do for quite some time. Only I realized I couldn't ruin his life. I couldn't say, I'm your real mom. But I guess fate took pity on me, because that boy Margaret looked at Natasha very carefully. He came to my school to study, so I was able to see him grow up. I could watch him almost every day. It went on like that for a very long time. And then I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand it, and I went to his parents. I realized I had to talk to them about it. I wanted them to understand me, and maybe they would allow me to visit them sometimes, to see my boy more often. But they said no. They were angry with me. So it's scary to remember. Margaret had a drink, and they told her not to go near him again, that they transferred me to another school. And they thought I should be given more money, but they didn't have much money in cash back then. She nodded at the jewelry, still in Natalie's hand. They gave me this. They said it was silver and diamonds, that it was antique and worth a lot of money. What do I care about money? I've lost my son. Margaret spoke very softly now, almost in a whisper. I realized it was time I stopped seeing him, that it only hurt my soul. That's how I retreated. And then when he grew up, did you ever think of meeting him and explaining everything? Natalie asked. No, Margaret shook her head. How would that be? Think about it. He's thought he was family all his life. No, I only sometimes. After the summer camp incident, he wrote me letters to congratulate me on holidays. It was enough for me to read letters from him a couple times a year or talk to him on the phone. After the camp incident, Natalie asked her question glumly. Until now, she had taken Margaret's story a little lightly. But now her last words were rapidly coming together, and what Natalie knew of this teacher of her husband's. No, she exhaled. It can't be Chris. And it is him. Margaret sighed. Chris, my darling, he died and I wasn't even there. I was there to see him off. I must have been a bad mother. Natalie jumped up and paced the room. It just didn't make sense. Could it be that her Chris had spent his whole life in ignorance of his origins, and yet he had regular, even if formal, contact with his birth mother? Was it possible that his in-laws and even her to his wife had not revealed this secret about his origins? And now what? It turned out that this old woman, she is, in fact, her own mother-in-law. And she's also Matt and Nick's own grandmother. You're confused, Natalie repeated. And take it away, she added, holding out the jewelry. I don't need it. And I'm sorry, but you're wrong. It can't be. Why not? Margaret asked. And that simple question made Natasha freeze. Why indeed? Is the fact that a child was given up for adoption and adopted and then no one told him the truth is such an incredible story. No, it's not. There's more to life than that. And Natalie understood that perfectly well, which made her feel even more confused. What was she to do with all this information? I took it, Margaret said, pointing her finger at the sparkling pendants so they would believe I wouldn't say anything to him, or they'd probably break up and move to another town. And I kept my word. And no matter how hard life got, I didn't sell that thing because I don't need it now. But Chris is gone. My little boy is gone. And you're his wife and my daughter-in-law, so take it. You're poor, I know. Sell it and you'll be able to raise my grandchildren. And if you don't believe me, Margaret added grimly to me, then ask your mother-in-law, Chris's adoptive mother, and show it to her and see what she'll tell you. Excuse me, said Natalie. I have to go. I'll be sure to think about everything. She walked, or rather jumped, out of the old lady's room and then out of the apartment. Stepping out of the entryway, she skipped impolitely. No reaction whatsoever to the question about how Margaret's visit had gone. The question had been asked by one of the grandmothers on the bench. No, Natasha needed to get as far away from this place as possible. Period. Yes, the day hadn't gone quite as she planned, precisely because she was absorbed in her own thoughts and worries. She didn't notice that her children were looking at each other puzzled, elbowing each other. And when their mothers turned away, they whispered. No, Natalie didn't care about any of that. She just made lunch, then dinner. Today, by the way, she picked up Nick and Matt from kindergarten much earlier in their group. One of the kids got the flu, due to which to attend kindergarten. Now it was not necessary about one quarantine for a week. And on this occasion, by the way, Natalie even experienced some relief. After all, now it was not necessary to clap supporters, because if the matinee was held, she would have to help her sons with the fakes. They were tasked with making a paper bouquet of tulips. However, not attending the kindergarten also created certain problems. After all, just tomorrow Natalie had to go to work, and the boys, of course, could not be left alone, but a solution was quickly found. May, a neighbor, agreed to look after the boys for a few hours a day, taking them to herself. May herself was also a mom, but her child in principle was not a daycare center. Not because he was sick, BT doughy, no, Archie was doing wonderfully well health-wise, but because of an unusually capricious degree of assiduity, a tendency to prank and disobedience. But he got on with Nick and Matt just fine, by the way. And even as May was surprised to recognize more than once in their society, Archie behaved much more well-mannered and positive in all senses. Entering the Queen's diamond jewelry boutique, Natalie was a little confused. It seemed to her that now she would be told from the doorstep that it was all a ridiculous mistake, and instead of her, they had already taken another 100 times more suitable applicant. But how had she been wrong? Alex met her at the doorstep and gave her a tour of the store. It turned out he knew a lot about jewelry. He was poring over the names of stones, talking about collections from leading jewelry houses. Natalie, by the way, looked at a couple of price tags and was simply shocked. No, of course, she understood that rich people bought such things, but to give so much money for some earrings with a couple of stones that would be enough to buy 2 large apartments in the center of the city. Natalie just couldn't imagine how much one had to earn to afford such a thing, and how one could spend money like that, when it seemed there were so many other important things in the world where they could be used, for example, to help orphans. Alex smoothly but resolutely introduced her to the specifics of the store, showed her the back rooms, bragged about the luxurious security system digital technology, and finally introduced her to the plump curly brunette with a stern expression on her face. Meet Viola, our, so to speak, permanent leader and director of this branch of the jewelry chain. Natalie said hello and was startled. Surely this strict aunt of about 50 years old would smear her now. But she was wrong again. Viola turned out to be a friendly and patient person. She said that for the first 2 weeks, Natalie would be paired with her. This is a common practice for their store, a kind of mentoring, after which she will become an independent salesperson, a consultant. And then Natalie tapped her finger on a stack of books. Materials for self-education, so to speak. It is not necessary to learn by rote, but it is very desirable to familiarize yourself with them. Do you understand? Our customers want the seller can not only pull the goods from the showcase, but also able to present it beautifully. This means that it is important to be able to talk about the origin of stones features, for example, types of clasps on the necklace. Anyway, you'll figure it out. I'll try my best, Natalie swallowed nervously. Yeah, she thought, I'm a fool. She laughed at her sons when they said they were afraid to go to first grade because there would be so much science. Well, maybe she's scared about the same thing now. The first day of work went well. Natalie stood in front of Viola and watched her interact with the customers. A bald man in a white suit came in and picked out some ruby cufflinks. Here came a lady with a tiny syringe, which sat right in her bag, looking out of their funny face. The lady went through bracelets for a long time, complaining that she needed turquoise strictly from Afghanistan because it was better there. And finally, when Viola showed her what she wanted, she bought everything and left. There were other people. Natalie knew it was not good to count other people's money, but she was amazed how easy it was for people to make such large purchases. And then two people entered the store, a young couple. Here we go, Kat stretched out. Another saleswoman who had been looking at Natasha with a contemptuous sneer and envy from the start. It's the third time the beggars have come in. All they do is look and buy nothing. Natalie looked closely at the couple. The girl was late in her pregnancy and dressed like her companion. Very simply cheap, but clean and neat. There's your test. Viola smiled suddenly at her student and gave her a gentle nudge in their direction. Go on. Good afternoon. May I ask if I can be of any help to you? Natalie took a deep breath and spoke the way Viola had taught her. Hello. The girl smiled shyly in return. Would we like to see something with pearls? Yes, of course. Natalie began to sing about what a gorgeous collection of pearls they had, including black and a very rare gold one. But then she realized that these people wouldn't buy them, and the girl saw the price tags on the things Natalie was praising. But you know, I would advise you to pay attention to the products with river pearls. Suddenly decided to change the line of trying to make a sale Natalie, despite the fact that he is of farm origin. In terms of characteristics, it is not inferior to wild pearls. It was the kind of pearls that back in the 16th century were on par with fur and highly valued in Venice. And Natalie told some interesting facts. She showed closer earrings, beads, rings, and other items. Then the girl sighed. Probably this ring right here. And earrings, said the guy. His companion dropped her gaze. She was surprised at his generosity. Yes, he said, it's okay, Amy. We can afford it. Don't worry, David's still calling me over. I've got some more movers coming in. Kat's at the other end of the hall and poked her palm. Those poor customers were so hilarious. And when they left, Kat was the one who started discussing them with her co-workers. Gossiping girls asked Viola sternly as she approached them. Then she turned to Natasha. I can praise you, because Alex says that we always appreciate every customer, literally every customer, and for everyone we must be able to find the right products, even if it took all day. Kat and her celestial friends opened their mouths because the praise from Viola was no easier to wait for than a snowfall in the middle of July. In the afternoon, Alex stopped by the boutique again and offered to pick up Natalie for a ride home. She could have taken public transportation, of course, but unexpectedly she agreed. For what, by the way? She received another look full of dislike from Kat, who was, like some other saleswoman in this jewelry chain, a little unrequitedly in love with Alex. True, this crush was mostly based not on his human qualities, but on the fact that he was very rich and not bad looking. But how was the first day of work? Alex asked Natalie, and it was not a formality. He was really interested. She told him everything in detail. What is it? She asked, perplexed, when Alex, when they had already arrived at her house, suddenly took out a wad of bills from his wallet. An advance, he answered simply, and a bonus, he added, noticing how suspiciously Natalie looked at the money because it was a lot for an advance. I have an original approach, Alex said. Looking with the most honest eyes, I always give a bonus to employees at the beginning of work to motivate them. Thank you, said Natalie, and took the money. It was so unexpected, but it was also very convenient. Now she could pay off almost all of her rent and buy groceries and perhaps a new jacket for Matt. The sleeves were already up to her elbows. The first full shift was scheduled for tomorrow. Natalie said goodbye to Alex and even waved goodbye to him as she walked toward her driveway. Who was that? A hoarse, familiar voice sounded behind her. Natalie turned around, almost jumping up, and saw Tom. "Hi," she said. "Yeah, it's work." "Work?" Tom grinned and came closer. "Why aren't the buses running?" "Tom," Natalie shrugged. She didn't like the feel of his hand on hers. "But don't be silly. It's just interesting. So you don't have time to meet, but you have time to ride around with men." "He's not a man, he's my employer." Natalie only now suddenly realized vividly what disgusting manners Nikolai had in terms of personal hygiene. "Tom, I'm tired. Let's talk later." "Okay." "When later?" He craned his neck. Then evasively replied Natalie, "I'm busy. I have a new job." "Where?" "At the jewelry store." "Ah," stretched out Tom. He hummed again. "That's clear, but see you later." "I'll come by later," he added with a nudge, looking over his shoulder. "I mean, we're serious. I mean, we're practically family. Your boys will be calling me Baya soon." No way in hell, Natalie thought. "I don't want a father like you for my sons." But she didn't say it out loud. She went home. Her mood was a little ruined, and that inner nervous tension that makes you dizzy and tight in your chest had returned. Because Natalie realized that perhaps it was time to end this relationship with Nicholas, because he may not be a bad man in general, but she definitely and absolutely does not see him as a man with whom she would like to create a family. And what kind of man should he be? Natalie pondered, going up to her floor and calling her neighbor to pick up her children from her. Perhaps, she decided, he must be like Alex. Not in the sense of wealth, and that wasn't the most important thing in a life partner, but in the sense of charm and generosity and something else. Yes, she didn't know Alex very well, but she thought he was a good man. The next days, Natalie went to work with ease and a smile. It all turned out to be very interesting, and she learned to ignore Kat's slanted glances, especially since Viola had talked to her quietly about something. And there was no open hostility. Little by little, Natalie was getting to grips with the new world of luxury jewelry. She was beginning to understand them. And though this world still seemed completely foreign to her, she also began to realize that gemstones were beautiful, wondrous creations of nature, in and of themselves, regardless of how much people valued them. Not every day, but Alex gave Natalie a ride home, and one day he invited her to stop by a cafe on the way. The weather was chilly gray, and he said, "Why not brighten up this gloomy spring with a cup of hot chocolate?" Natalie agreed. After all, it's not a date, she thought. What kind of date could they have? People from different worlds? No, of course it's not a date. It's just that Alex is such a person. He seems to make new acquaintances easily. He's open and outgoing. And what was Natalie's surprise when Alex suddenly took her hand that day and gently, affectionately squeezed her fingers. Now that contained some sort of romantic innuendo. She had looked at him, then surprised, almost frightened, and he had said in his usual easy manner that he liked her very much. "Or do you have someone else?" he asked. "No," Natalie answered, and then she gave herself a mental smack. She hadn't broken up with Tom as she should have, but had been avoiding him. But what she'd said couldn't be undone. And then, anyway, Natasha received a large basket of flowers at her home address on the next weekend, complete with exotic fruit and a couple of black and brown teddy bears. Alex apologized that they wouldn't be able to see each other as agreed because he had urgent business to attend to. He also added that flowers for her, toys for her sons, and fruit for everyone. The call from May caught Natalie off guard. She was just about to take advantage of her day off to stop by a store that was having a sale on home textiles to pick out new dinosaur bedding sets for her sons. And suddenly the neighbor called and in a voice shaking, scared and changing, reported that today, as usual, she took Archie for a walk in the yard. And also with them went the children Natalie had left in her care. And then, well, Nick and Matt got lost. They slipped away. Marina had to turn her back for a minute. "Don't worry," May asked gently. "They probably decided to walk to the store for some caramels, or to the neighbor's yard. I'm looking for them now. I just thought I'd tell you to maybe come back and look for them too." Natalie didn't remember how she'd gotten back. She was in shock, horror, panic. Her mind was painting 1,000 pictures of what had happened to her babies, and it was one worse than the other. "No, we certainly don't have anything for that kind of money," the woman replied sternly and harshly, even rudely. A saleswoman in a flower shop. "Where are the boys?" A big secret from everyone in the world escaped to buy a bouquet of flowers for their mother on the eve of March 8th. Not at all. Nick stretched out pitifully, and his lips trembled. Oh, come on, Lois. Pushed the saleswoman in the side of her collie. Look how cute they are. They've saved up and want to please their mother. You don't want to bother with them. I rolled my eyes and poked Jim. Guys, let me show you something. Amy leaned over and looked into the eyes of both brothers. They were marvelously charming, direct, good-natured boys. Amy herself was about to have her firstborn. According to the ultrasound, it was a boy. She was amazed by these boys who showed up at the flower stall to buy flowers. True, the money they had on them was just enough for nothing. 3 carnations from the vase of merchandise at most. Amy sighed and wondered if they should add some money from their personal funds. Then they could perhaps buy a few roses. Look how pretty it is. Nick enthusiastically told Matt and showed his hand a floral arrangement of sky blue and snow white flowers placed in a box, tied with a pink ribbon. Auntie, how much is this? Matt asked. Jim rolled her eyes. As much as you can. Boys, where's your mom? Amy asked. Why are you guys here alone? Why are you here alone? Jim added sternly. What about us? Matt was suddenly afraid that they would be captured. So how are there no adults around? Generally sent to the orphanage. Mom in the store began to lie he on the move, and we just so dropped by. Nick, let's go. He pulled his little brother by the sleeve, and together they ran out into the street, and they ran sideways. Whew. Matt ran his hand over his forehead. We're in trouble. What are we going to do now? Nick asked pitifully. Matt, Nick, are you doing something? A familiar voice suddenly sounded. Alex had visited Natalie's house once in the past weeks and had met her sons. And now driving down the street, he suddenly noticed the boys. But Natalie was not with them for some reason. The brothers looked at him when he got out of the car. What about us? And Mom was at the store, Nick said, and immediately blushed to his ears. He couldn't lie at all. We're on our way home now. Matt put in a word. It's all right. You're not very good liars. You know that, don't you? Alex smiled and stood up, blocking the way. What's up with you guys? The brothers looked at each other again. Suddenly, they started talking in chorus about how bad it is, that Mom is sad, that Dad used to give her flowers on March 8th, and they wanted to give them. But not enough money. The kids also blabbed that they ran away from the neighbor who was entrusted to look after them. It's all clear with you. Alex shook his head. Yes, it's May. She's probably going crazy in there. Maybe your mom's already been disturbed. Okay, no tears. Okay. Hurriedly, he turned to them and especially to Nick, who was already squinting, began. Let me take you home. But first, give us that bouquet over there, said Nick. When together with his brother and Alex entered the kiosk. What a day. Lois rolled her eyes. There's catching stray dogs. What about these kids? She muttered under her breath and then said louder. I already told you, for your pennies here cannot buy anything. Give us, please, this bouquet, said Alex, pulling out his wallet. Jim looked at him skeptically at first, but immediately softened. She knew how to recognize wealthy clients, and so she immediately scattered in all sorts of nice words, took out a bouquet and handed it to the client. Are these your children? She decided to keep the conversation going. Alex had no time to answer. It was done for him by Nick, who, like his brother, was very afraid that something bad was waiting for them for walking alone without their mom. It's our dad, he said, and grabbed Alex's hand tighter. Finally, they walked out of the flower shop. Matt said he wanted to carry the flowers himself, so Alex gave them to him. Then he put the brothers in the car and headed toward Natalie's house. On the way, he thought about the strange feeling that had arisen in his heart when the boy had called him father. It was something exciting, a little frightening, but mostly a pinching, beautiful feeling. Alex was definitely lucky for chance encounters today, because as he pulled up in front of Natalie's house, he saw her. She was running through the yard, shouting her son's names loudly. Mom, yelled Matt and skipped toward her. Nick ran with him. Alex also went in the same direction, not forgetting to grab the bouquet. My darlings. Natalie caught her sons in her arms and now crying from the experience of anxiety and joy showered with tender words. Alex told her what had happened. Why? Natalie grabbed Matt, the main instigator of what had happened, shook him up a little. I almost lost my mind. Don't ever do that again. Natalie, it ended well. Well, don't. Alex interceded for the little adventurer. Look at the beautiful bouquet they chose for you. Bouquet, Ein. She first paid attention to the flowers, aghast. So beautiful was the composition of the gifts of Flora. Natalie opened her mouth. She wanted to ask where the money had come from, but she guessed right away. You shouldn't have, she said. Shy, wasn't it? Actually, I was going to wish you a happy March 8th anyway, Alex shrugged. So you can consider it a bouquet from all three of us. He wanted to say that on the occasion of the holiday, why don't they all go to a cafe? And Natalie realized at that moment that she really liked Alex in a romantic way. And Nick and Matt realized that they also liked him as a family friend, that he was 1,000 times better than Uncle Tom. And they didn't mind him visiting them. But then a new face appeared near them. Alex. He was called out by a young woman in an elegant pantsuit. Shock magazine, I made an appointment for you, but you ignored me. Alex's face changed. Through Natalie a curt, I'm sorry, I'll be right back, and grabbed the press representative under the elbow, literally dragging her aside. This wasn't just any reporter. Alex had once had an affair with her and they parted ugly. And since then, this person seemed determined to spread all the ridiculous rumors about him that she could gather or even make up. Alex had already threatened more than once that he would get the lowbrow magazine closed down. And now I wish I'd taken care of it. We have nothing to talk about, he said dryly. I've already explained to you that we're done. And stop getting personal. Aha, that's what you mean, the journalist threw off her chin and flashed her eyes dangerously. You have an icy heart. We just didn't see eye to eye, and it wouldn't have worked out. For what must be the 1,000th time, Alex repeated. I hate you, whispered the journalist. It's mutual. He grinned back. So you're with her now. It's none of your business. Yes, it is. I forgot. We broke up. The reporter snorted. Oh, she knows. Ah, her eyes were shining now, like a hungry tiger that had smelled its prey. She doesn't know. Yes, it's none of your business. And it's none of your business, Alex said. But it was too late. Hey, journalist, Natalie waved her hands. Do you know that Alex is Sam's cousin, who killed your husband? It seemed to Natalie that heaven and earth had changed places, that the surrounding reality had run out of air and that she was falling into the abyss. No, it couldn't be true. But something told her it wasn't a lie. She looked at Alex shocked, disbelieving. What are you like? He said to his ex-girlfriend and paid no further attention to her. Walked over to Natalie. Look, I can explain everything. You don't have to. Natalie put her hands out in front of her. Don't, stay away, please. She squeezed her eyes shut. Spots of fire danced beneath the branches. How lucky were the boys, the sons, not to hear that. 5 minutes earlier, May had shown up and taken them home. That is, to her house for now, promising to feed them soup along with her Archie. Alex obeyed and stopped. He saw the hurt, disappointment, and something much deeper and darker than the usual resentment splashed in Natalie's eyes. He saw in those eyes that he didn't stand a chance. Should I leave? Quietly he asked. She didn't answer, just nodded. And then she turned away and walked toward the entrance, and how Alex wanted to rush after her, to turn her to him, to make her look him in the eye and explain everything, to make her believe the truth that changed everything, that explained everything. But he realized that trying to do such a thing would make things worse. Perhaps she needed time. Or did everything now appear to be destroyed forever? He didn't know that, but all he knew was that right now he had to leave. It was weird to the point of being creepy. But the rest of the day was normal for Natalie, in the sense that she didn't give anything away to her sons. They dismantled the bouquet together and moved it to the biggest vase they could find. And then they watched cartoons together. And just after putting their little ones to bed, Natalie let herself cry. She couldn't figure out how he could lie to her and how it had even happened and what was it. He knew she couldn't help but know, didn't he? I mean, she had told him everything about herself back then. So what had he done? Why him? The next morning, Natalie didn't go to the Queen's Diamond Boutique because she absolutely did not want a job from a man who was from that very same family. Anyway, Natalie couldn't even think about Alex now. She wasn't surprised when she woke up the next morning with a headache, and a sickening feeling as if the blows of fate weren't over for her and something bad was about to happen. After all, decided Natalie good in life, surely there must be some black streaks to go along with it, right? And who could guarantee that the next black streak for her little family wouldn't drag on for 100 years? The call from an unknown number rang when Natalie sat down to mend the denim jacket Matt had torn during the yard games, and she was on pins and needles. Because on top of everything else, Nick had spiked a fever during the night. Nick was always sick like that. First, he'd get sick, feverish and sick, and then literally in less than 24 hours. He was on the mend in no time, so he was reacting to colds. And yesterday, while on his crazy adventures with his brother, he'd been running around town. Natalie was sure her son had a cold. Probably some kind of spam, Natalie thought, but something compelled her to answer. Yes, she asked absent-mindedly. Who's calling and what's it about? She didn't understand because the voice on the other end, which belonged to an older woman, sounded very anxious and its owner was confused. But at last they explained themselves. It turned out to be a call from one of the vigilant neighbors of the pensioners, with whom Natalie had already made a brief acquaintance when she visited Margaret. And it turned out that Elizabeth had carried out her threat and gotten rid of Margaret. The caller introduced herself as Joan and explained that Margaret herself had given her Natalie's number not long ago. Did the poor girl sense that something bad might happen to her and begged her to send word to the only person who could possibly care about her? Natalie was shocked by what she heard. But what can I do to help? She asked. What had happened in the first place? Terrible. Joan blurted out a secret story. It turned out that Margaret had had a heart attack not long ago and had been called to an ambulance, and Elizabeth, after a while, taking advantage of Margaret's weak, sickly condition, forced her by trickery, blackmail, and deceit to give her part of the apartment that belonged to Margaret. She promised that everything would be fine and that this would only make it easier for her to receive her inheritance in the future. And then Elizabeth decided that since she was the boss of the place, she could get rid of the old woman altogether. She lied to Margaret that she was taking her to a sanatorium and drove her to an empty cottage community and left her there, saying that it would be better for Margaret to live there now, rather than get in the way in the apartment. Oh, sighed Natalie. What's to be done now then? Obviously you have to take her away, Joan blurted out. Anyway, Margaret said you're her friend. And then Faith dictated which cottage community Margaret had been taken to, where and how to find her there. Thanking her for the news, Natalie ended the call. Really, what was there to do? No, she didn't doubt in the slightest that Margaret had to be bailed out, nor did she shrug off the reality of the whole affair. After all, it was well known how helpless and naive old people could be, but she just couldn't imagine how to deal with it. And here I feel like the most intrusive, most insufferable person in the world. Natalie went to her neighbor again to ask her to watch the boys some more, plus give Nick his antipyretics and other needed medications on time as scheduled. A quarter of an hour later, Natalie was already out of the driveway and racing to the bus stop. Natalie, a familiar voice called out to her. She turned around, rolled her eyes. Tom was the only thing missing right now. We need to talk, he said, slouching, walking toward her, his gait unsteady, his face swollen. Clearly, he'd been drinking. How long are you going to run away from me? He asked. Angry. What are you doing? We're family. Tom sighed to Natalie. I don't have time, and we're not family. Ah stretched it and crooked grin. How did you need that before, Tom? To feed your puppies. And now you're tangling with a millionaire. You think he wants your puppies, and he doesn't care about you at all. He shut his mouth and apologized, and then he left. Just as Alex appeared so unexpectedly close by, did he materialize out of thin air. But no, Natalie realized. He just walked up, and she'd been so preoccupied with worry that she hadn't noticed his car was nearby. Yeah, you went, Tom, to Alex, but he took him by the scruff of the neck. The men locked eyes. Get out of here, for the last time. Alex said, believe me, you don't want to mess with me. Back off, you psycho. Tom recoiled, deliberately squeamish from the other man's touch. He gave Natalie a contemptuous look and spat under his feet. Oh, come on, you crazy chicken. It's human to her. Tom drunkenly staggered off into the backyards. I know you can tell me, Alex said, that you don't want to see me and know that I'm a monster and a liar. But I'm begging you, just let me tell Natalie." And Alex spoke up. He admitted that yes, he knew who she was from the beginning, because he did belong to that family. However, that was exactly what kinship was. And in fact, Alex had hardly interacted with those people and had never lived with them together ever, but he knew about that history. And when he met Natalie and found out who she was, he just couldn't admit it. Why not? Because he realized that she would have been prejudiced against him, to say the least. And it was important to him very much, because from the very beginning he began to feel sympathy for her. He was afraid that she would start treating him based on the fact that one of his relatives had done it. And that's basically stupid, because Alex hadn't spoken to this cousin in years. And they were completely different people in general. But then I realized that one day you're going to find out anyway. Sad, he finished. I know I should have told you myself, but I kept procrastinating. I thought I'd let a little more time pass. And then he spread his hands. How did it end? It was very strange to Natalie. She never imagined that a conversation could make such a difference. But right now, she no longer felt the resentments of anger and almost hatred that burned her from the inside out. Just yesterday, she had suddenly realized that Alex, yes, he was a completely different person. He didn't owe it to the mere power of his ancestry to be like his cousin. And yes, Natalie believed his every word. And it wasn't even just faith, but some deep, almost instinctual conviction that he wasn't deceiving her. That he was exactly the kind of man he had seemed to her in all the past days of their acquaintance. But all of that Natalie didn't say now. She only nodded, and they met gazes. And though it didn't seem like it was enough, but right now it was more than enough for Alex. And then Natalie said that she couldn't stay any longer, unfortunately, because she had something urgent to do. What was it? Alex asked. And she answered him. I'll drive you, he said. And Natalie got into his car, and as they drove to the cottage community, she told him everything. Margaret? Alex exclaimed. But I know her. She used to teach at school, at a private grammar school, where I studied for a short time. Then she was said to have gone away. I think she and her husband were trying to settle in another city. I remember her. She was, he smiled sadly, a wonderful teacher. She gave all of herself to her students. Everything turned out to be exactly as Natalie had fearfully assumed. The dacha community was now in some disrepair. It was a little early for gardening after all. Margaret found herself in a cottage so dilapidated that it looked as if it might collapse in a gust of wind. The poor old woman was freezing. Her sister-in-law hadn't even bothered to give her warm clothes, and she didn't seem to be thinking straight. But then she suddenly called Natalie by name and literally clung to her, as if she could otherwise be lost in the big world around her. Alex said that Nana needed to be seen by the doctors. She was obviously suffering from hypothermia, and she was psychologically traumatized from the eviction. Alex took Margaret to one of the best private clinics in the city, where she was accepted as the most expensive client thanks to his money. And then Alex said in his usual decisive manner that he would arrange everything. Rent an apartment for Margaret, hire a good caregiver, and also, if she wanted, help her to deal with the fact that she would put in place a snooty daughter-in-law. But Margaret didn't want to. She forgave Elizabeth and she forgave her son too. She could no longer trust them to be her own people. I am alone with everything in the world, quietly cried the old woman. She was sitting in a single room. No, said Natalie, and approaching her bedside, gently took her hand. You are not alone, you have me. The words came hard to her, but she knew she was doing the right thing. Your daughter-in-law and your grandchildren. Truth. Margaret's hopeful eyes dropped. Yes, Natalie smiled at her. And if you want to, you can move in with us after the hospital. You did the right thing, Alex said. When he and Natasha left the room, Margaret was resting, finally catching up on her sleep. I hope so, sighed Natalie. Did I really have a choice? You always do. You could have just agreed to let me take care of her, provide for her at her age. But you realized that wouldn't have been enough for her. What she really needs is something else. Natalie said thoughtfully. Yes, Alex nodded. What do you need? The question took her by surprise. But when she met his gaze, Natalie suddenly realized that it seemed that the answer to that question was almost already written in the depths of her heart. She just needed to find the courage to read it and accept it. "I'm not rushing," you said, as if Alex read her thoughts. "But I want to know if I have a chance." Natalie was slow to answer, but Alex was very patient indeed, and eventually, and not even too late, he waited. 6 months later, he and Natalie were married. Her sons received him enthusiastically. Of course, they too had to discover the truth, but they, since explained everything to them, calmly accepted these facts. Normal. After the wedding, Natalie and the children moved in with Alex. He had a spacious 2-story cottage in the suburbs. And that's where Margaret moved in. And it turned out, by the way, that in normal conditions, when she does not stand over the soul-angry Elizabeth, all is absolutely fine with her head. And she even took to helping Misha and Nick with their schoolwork. And also Margaret, though forgiven, but now did not communicate with her adopted son and his wife at all. Despite the fact that Natalie had the option of not working at all, she told Alex honestly that it would be boring for her to live like that. And so he slowly began to introduce her to the affairs of his company, which owned jewelry showrooms. The adoptive parents of Natalie's dead husband were very unhappy that she had learned their secret, and were even more unhappy that Natalie might tell her grandchildren. But Natalie decided that Matt and Nick, they needed to know that they had a loving, kind, native grandmother. And another year later, Alex and Natalie had a child together, a girl. And although Alex really wanted to name her something in honor of a gemstone, such as ruby or amber, Natalie finally persuaded him to choose a more appropriate name, and the girl was named.
The sea breeze playfully fluttered the curtains of the wide-open windows in room 13 of the Albatross Hotel. The dark blue sky, which seemed unrealistically low, was studded with 1,000 stars. Cindy sat on the edge of the bed and stared out into the night's height and infinity, swallowing her tears and trying not to pay attention to the way her husband was struggling with the knot of his tie, pulling on a suit he'd hastily bought before a corporate party. "And that these hysterics to me no longer arranged," he threw, frowning at his reflection in the mirror. "Got it? Got it?" Cindy sighed and sniffled. This was supposed to be their first family vacation, and it turned out Harvey was leaving her for a mistress. He generously promised that he'd be back in the morning so they could go on some excursion because, as he said to himself, he wasn't a monster to leave his redneck without a cultural program. "I picked you up on the street," grinned her husband, turning away from the mirrored door of the closet. "You're supposed to kiss my feet, so..." "Oh, Cindy, you'd better shut up. You're going to end up back in the dumpster. Got it?" "Yes," the girl nodded. Actually, she would never have said that out loud, but over the last 6 months it had begun to seem to her that if she were a dog, she would be more inclined than any other dog to memorize and obey every command perfectly. Because it was this obedience and following orders that her own husband now constantly demanded of her. Cindy was born in a small mining town and was a round orphan mom, and dad died when the girl was 6 years old in a car accident. She was saved from the orphanage by a great aunt and in principle, though she did not spoil her with affection, but did not offend her. But then she also passed away. A short-lived cancer took away the last close person neatly under Cindy's 18th birthday. In the meantime, the house they lived in had fallen into disrepair and was about to be declared an emergency. Cindy had just graduated from high school and was struggling to make a living, doing anything to get paid. Harvey came to town on a business trip. He was a senior manager for a trucking company. Once he went for a snack in a local cafe, but in fact in an inexpensive canteen, and naturally, as a sophisticated service resident of the big city, was terribly dissatisfied with everything. Cindy worked there as a waitress, served his table. She took all the claims, apologized, and then, along with tips, she fell on her tray a note with a phone number, and she called it, and then Harvey asked her out. And on the third date, he told her what he wanted, and he wanted to ask her to marry him. He immediately voiced his attitude: serious relationship, a strong family, where the wife is engaged in the house and husband, and not spinning her tail, building her career, or some other nonsense doing. Harvey wasn't a clairvoyant, and didn't have the talents of FBI profilers, but he vividly recognized Cindy as inexperienced, timid, and most importantly, driven. Just the kind of woman he needed. At first, Cindy felt like Cinderella, who had lived to see her happily ever after. She sincerely tried to please her husband in everything, and his discontent, reproaches, and admonitions were taken for granted and even useful, because she had to learn to be a good wife. Harvey decided how much to allocate for food, clothing, entertainment, and himself. By the way, he always kept in priority. 3 cutlates on a plate for him, 1 for his wife, a new sheepskin coat for winter, because the old one had frayed sleeves. Boots. My husband frowned once. Then, obey her husband and do everything for him. Harvey shouted and banged his fist on the table so hard that all the dishes clinked, as if they too had realized who was the master of the house and who was not to be crossed under any circumstances. Cindy didn't. She thought for the first time that her husband was being unfair to her. She couldn't understand what was wrong with her wanting to be able to earn money too. Things could happen. Maybe he'd lose his job, and while he was looking for a new one, her penny would come in handy. And then, Cindy was terribly afraid to admit it, but sometimes she wondered what would happen to her if one day Harvey fell out of love with her. What would she do then? She didn't even have a place to live in her hometown. They'd sold it as soon as they were married, and the proceeds went into the family budget. What did they buy with it? I think they upgraded Harvey's car and took in appliances. However, Cindy tried to chase such harmful and also ungrateful, stupid thoughts away from herself. After all, on the whole, their marriage was normal. Yes, that was the definition she most often thought of. And she also tried with the diligence of a lost traveler in the winter woods, trying to keep the fire burning, to do her part to make sure that nothing threatened the marriage from her side. Because Cindy loved Harvey after all. Yes, things had gotten complicated at times in their relationship. But how many other moments were there when it was enough for her to cuddle up to her husband in the evening, to take shelter under his strong arm, and the whole outside world seemed to disappear, to melt away. Only the two of them remained, and it seemed that all the difficulties were just vanity and trifles. But love, real and strong, was still there in their union. It's just sometimes hard to see it behind life's troubles, stresses, and all that. So when 3 months ago Harvey announced that they would go on vacation and to the sea, Cindy decided that now, perhaps, she should consider herself the happiest person in the world. She wouldn't have dared to ask about it directly, but she thought it was Harvey's way of making amends for all that had gone wrong between them. He even, by the way, gave her a good amount of money to go shopping, because it was necessary to take a new swimsuit, beach towels, sunscreen, travel. By the way, Harvey, that is called, snatched a gorgeous last-hop tour to a small island country south of India. The manager in the travel agency lulled Nightingale Country. This relatively recently decided to open for tourists and get there, in fact, was a huge success. Travelers expected clean, golden beaches, a national park with endemic species of birds and butterflies, city tours, and even the opportunity to admire the palace of the local ruler from afar. Formerly, it was a prince in his dynasty, but in the international press, often this man was called dictator. The main thing, of course, is to follow the rules, said the manager of the travel agency after the trip was sold. Local etiquette, you know. Yeah, Harvey said absent-mindedly, who had just gotten a text message from work, but not about work. Here, take a booklet. The manager smiled sweetly and handed out a mini magazine, which told all sorts of tempting things for tourists, plus gave the very recommendations on how not to get into a lot of trouble. The thing was that the code of laws of this country differed in some respects draconian rules. In particular, it was forbidden to take out local money because they depicted members of the royal family. It was also forbidden to take shells from local beaches as souvenirs. Harvey took the booklet and stuck it in his pocket later. At home, let his wife read it and enjoy it. Right now, he had more important things to worry about. For a whole month, Harvey had been having an affair with Sarah from the personnel department at work. She was a tidbit divorced, but not a single mother. In a new marriage is not raring to go, sits on the fitness, figure appetizing, and most importantly, nature passionate. Harvey she quickly took in a turn, and he, although in principle previously did not think about cheating on his wife, quickly decided that in vain, limited himself, loyalty kept Cindy. In general, she was the right woman for him, as a mistress in the house. But there was no passion, no fire like that in a long time. Her provincial innocence quickly became tiresome, and both women were like yin and yang. Cindy was naturally brown with straight hair below the shoulders, gray eyes, all thin and thin. Sarah artificial platinum blonde with green eyes. She could make up so that looked like a girl from the cover, dressed on the edge of propriety, and how she could laugh, poured on mermaid seductively, just so soul-taking out. And now she sent a message, so and so, I'm going on vacation. Sorry, honey, you'll have to do without me, because I'm flying to the tropics. Harvey grinned, and as soon as he left the office of the travel agency, dialed the number of his mistress. Sarah, sugar, you know, I'm going on vacation too. Well, no, not alone. Who cares? I'll tell her she'll sit down. She won't make a peep. So, get ready, my girl. In general, Harvey was not going to cheat on vacation so quickly, he thought. The first couple of days really spent with his wife, and then as a dessert to the mistress. But in the evening, when he reached for Cindy, she suddenly turned away, saying that she was tired after the road, that she was nauseous because she'd eaten something wrong, that she had a headache. Harvey was in a different mood, and when he realized he couldn't get any affection from his wife, he just snapped, because he didn't understand. I mean, can't you just be patient? He feeds and drinks this fool. He brought her to the seaside, and she turns her nose up. Her head hurts, you see. So it's her own fault that he's leaving now. The time was 8 o'clock in the evening, and the day in these latitudes was ending unusually early and abruptly, replaced by a humid, stuffy night. Harvey snorted and went into the shower. Then he began to dress and even began to hum something under his nose. "Where are you going?" his wife asked. He looked at her and wrinkled his nose. She was pale, with bags under her eyes, wrapped under a blanket as if she were freezing, her face wrinkled with displeasure. "Go for a walk? Or do you think I gave all this money to hang out with you?" "No, Cindy, you're not gonna ruin my vacation. You want to spend it in a hotel room. You're welcome, but don't whine to me afterward, you hear me?" Then Harvey reminded the girl where he'd picked her up from, and he slammed the door loudly and with all his might left the room. Cindy leaned back on the bed, buried herself in the pillows. She covered her eyes in the hope that she would doze off and sleep would ease her physical suffering. But what about her soul? It must have been half an hour. I couldn't fall asleep. From somewhere downstairs in the courtyard of the hotel, music and songs could be heard. Cindy squeezed her eyes shut and wiped away her tears, imagining her husband coming back in the morning, and her lying there like an abandoned, old and unnecessary thing. And he would come back, bringing another woman's scent, as if imprinted with the traces of someone else's caresses. Cindy had long ago guessed that Harvey had a mistress. She'd begun to suspect it almost a month ago. It was like a strange female instinct kicked in. The husband was different. It was so subtle and yet so obvious that it was impossible to put the change down to anything else. And now, while he was in the shower, she was quite bold and took his phone. And in the last messages with a contact labeled as accountant, Senior had explicitly stated that he was coming over, that they would go to a restaurant to eat shrimp, and then she would show him. There was a picture attached, but Cindy squeamishly threw the phone away. She was shaking. She'd never been so disgusted in her life, but she didn't say anything. She could have sworn on her life that talking wouldn't have changed anything. There was a burst of laughter under the windows, then something clapped, whistled, and right in front of the balcony of the room where Cindy was in the cocoon of the blanket, fireworks burst out, scattering myriads of golden and scarlet sparks. The girl involuntarily smiled at such a sight, like a fairy tale flower made of fire and precious stones that could not be ignored. Nobody died, did they? It's just her husband cheating, Cindy suddenly told herself. It was something strange. She suddenly realized she didn't want to cry anymore. It wasn't the tears that had run out. It wasn't the pain of her husband's cheating that had devastated her. It was just, she didn't want to cry anymore. And she also thought that it was really bad for her when she lost her mom and dad, even though she doesn't remember it almost. And now, her husband cheated on her. Not her first, not her last, as they say. She felt better, too. The nausea and headache were gone, and it was unbearably hot under the blanket. Cindy threw it off, sat up, put her feet on the floor, and then, as she was in her pajama shorts and tank top with thin straps, went out onto the balcony. She leaned on the railing and leaned forward and down. The sea, almost black in the night, but glowing with lights from the stars, the yachts moored in the harbor, and, of course, from the moon's path. It was noticeably cooler and fresher. The hotel staff, concerned about the guests' revelry, had dispersed those who had set off the fireworks, and now the courtyard below was empty. Cindy bit her lip and smiled at the thought that suddenly occurred to her. What if she went for a walk right now? After all, it was the first time she had ever been abroad, and Harvey had behaved like an asshole. Yes, there was no shame in calling her husband that in front of herself. He deserved it, but why should she suffer? Oh, he would have been happy if she had stayed in the room until morning, but to his shame, she wouldn't. Soon enough, Cindy stepped out of the shower and opened her closet. In general, her closet, even updated for the vacation, did not shine neither expensiveness nor variety. The girl for the first time so frankly thought about the fact that she all these years as it ignored the needs of many other women. For example, the need to dress beautifully, fashionably, to her own taste. She was an idiot, Cindy told herself. You really should have thought of that before. That if you want financial freedom, you have to be able to earn it yourself. Sighing at the years of marriage full of mistakes, Cindy took down the rack with the little black dress. She'd bought it for last New Year's Eve and had worn it out with her husband. It was a simple slip dress with an elegant boat neckline and a palm above the knee, with short sleeves that exposed her shoulders. After changing her clothes, the girl took a little mascara, a smoky pencil for a short arrow on her upper eyelids, and a transparent cherry-colored gloss on her lips. Cindy didn't normally wear heels, but she was going out, so she wore black shoes with a thin stiletto heel and a silver strap around her ankle. There wasn't much cash in her purse, because they were on vacation and Harvey had said that his wife was a fool and would get screwed over, so he would pay for everything himself. But she had some change, and Cindy hoped it would be enough for one cocktail. Non-alcoholic, of course. Cindy never drank anything stronger than kefir. By the way, she annoyed her husband because their couple at the same New Year's Eve parties became the object of jokes. Going down in the elevator to the hotel lobby, Cindy remembered that she had forgotten her phrasebook, but she hoped that for sure in the cafes and in general around many people probably speak English quite well. It was the second main language of the country after the local language, which was an intricately woven linguistic heritage of French, Portuguese, as well as local dialects that had been spoken in the area before European colonization. When we were just about to go on the trip, Cindy, by the way, told her husband that she knew English well at school, she had his in it, and then she was fond of it, purely for herself on the internet, studying with free materials. But Harvey put her in her place and said that she was a provincial fool and not to embarrass him there. He said that he himself would communicate with everyone he needed to, and in a phrasebook. Actually, Harvey didn't know English. More precisely, he knew, as Cindy was tacitly convinced, at the level of how do you do, and no more. Leaving the hotel lobby, Cindy followed the stone-paved path through an alley of tall shrubs. The white and lendenza pink flowers, which did not close even at night, exuded a sweet, candy-like fragrance. "We're closed, miss." The waitress waved her hands guiltily as she greeted her late guest at the closed doors of the cafe, where Cindy had hoped to spend her time over a coconut cocktail she had selected from the menu, having browsed online while on her way here. Fish poisoning in one of the guests, we're checking the entire kitchen and the supplier. We're off today and tomorrow too. "Oh, that's how it is," sighed the girl. There was only one more restaurant on the territory of the hotel, but it was there, judging by the text message, her husband had a date with his mistress, and naturally, Cindy had no desire to run into them there by chance. Do you know if there's anything else nearby? A cafe or something?" "Of course," smiled the waitress. "Across the street is the Velvet Restaurant." Cindy shook her head. She couldn't afford a restaurant. The waitress didn't know about her financial difficulties, of course, but she realized that this was not the right place for her. So she named another restaurant, a karaoke club, and a nightclub on the beach, which was about 10 minutes away along the promenade. The last option seemed to Cindy to be the best. In general, it was absolutely not in her habit to go out for a walk alone. Without her husband, especially at night, she would never have allowed herself to do that before. Nor, of course, would Harvey. But now it was different. It was as if Cindy had received a golden ticket that allowed her to break the unwritten rules of behavior of a good wife. The entrance to the club was unexpectedly crowded. The security guard, a tall black guy, let people in without any hurry and turned some of them aside. The familiar word, face control, flashed through Cindy's mind, and she thought that against the background of the modeling data of the girls entering the club, she would definitely fail it. I didn't want to be embarrassed, but then the queue moved forward abruptly and a flock of young people poured into the club, and Cindy found herself right in front of the mighty guard. "Good evening." She smiled guiltily and was about to turn around because, well, this club. The room bar has sodas and juice, but then a slender, gothic-looking brunette came out of the club and waved her hand. "Cindy?" "Me." The girl jabbed her finger at herself. She was confused as to who could possibly know her. The name, of course, was pronounced a little garbled, but that was probably because the speaker was foreign. "Cindy, where the hell have you been?" repeated the brunette, already irritably impatient. "Let me through." She waved to the guard and he nodded, took Cindy under the elbow and led her, almost dragged her inside the club. "Excuse me, do we know each other?" She tried to clarify the situation because she couldn't remember the gothic look on the girl's face at all. "No," she answered and confused the traveler completely. "They are waiting for you." "Me? Who?" Cindy wanted to understand what was going on here, but she didn't have time. She was grabbed under the arm again and dragged up the scarlet-carpeted staircase. Music was blaring, colored lights flashed in the darkness. The second floor of the club had a more private atmosphere. "Listen, how do you know my name?" "Shut up," the brunette grumbled. "That's it." She abruptly turned Cindy to her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and gave her a critical look. "I'll kill. One day, that's for sure. Although, there's something about the humble simpleton look." Another twist and a slight nudge in the back. Cindy almost lost her balance as she fell into the closed box. It was a private office, one side with a balcony overlooking the common area of the club. There were several men sitting on a sofa by a low table, but only one of them really caught Cindy's attention, and they locked gazes with him as she entered, swaying awkwardly on her heels. Blonde-haired, clearly not from around here, he was dressed in slacks, a white shirt and a purple vest. His whole look reminded Cindy of a jazz-era mafia movie she'd seen, and she had the stupid thought that this was what their man might look like. "Wow," said the bald guy sitting next to the blonde guy with a toothpick in his mouth. "You're just in time, baby." Cindy rounded her eyes. Now she was sure there had been a mistake, because she didn't know any of the four men. "Show some class, baby," exclaimed the other one in the wrinkled light-colored suit, who had clearly had more than enough to drink if you wanted to stay sane. And then he pulled out his wallet, took out a wad of bills, and waved them in the air, beckoning Cindy to him. "You're yummy." Something began to dawn on the girl. A crowd of men, she's alone. There is still an elevation near the table with drinks and appetizers that looks like a large bollard, and a pole in the middle of it. It looks like they were waiting for the girl too. Cindy felt a blush of shame flood her face as she was mistaken for a stripper. But why? Was she dressed so shamelessly? Not really. Compared to many of the other girls in the club, she was modest. "I'm sorry, you're mistaken," she muttered, and felt sick at the absurdity of the situation, at the fact that her knowledge of English had eroded from her head, and now her situation, if she couldn't explain herself clearly, could become much worse. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'm sorry, I have to go," she squeaked pitifully and rushed away. But another man, dressed in a black suit with a red tie, suddenly grabbed her across the waist and pulled her toward him. Cindy shrieked and fell on the couch, tried to fight back, but it only made things worse. Now she was lying with her belly across the knees of the guy who had caught her, and her nose was in the knees of the one who looked like a mobster. What a horror! "Dan, chill out," came the handsome, deep male voice above her. The next moment Cindy, floundering like a fawn barely learning to walk, was on her feet, supported by strong arms. "What's your name?" the blonde man asked sternly. Now that he stood up, it was clear that he was much taller than her husband, and to look him in the eyes you have to tilt your head. Cindy. No, Cindy. There's been a mistake. I didn't come this way," I mumbled, trying to pull away, but he wouldn't let me. It was embarrassing, hurtful, and strangely hot around this man. "So, you're not?" I'm not dancing," exhaled Cindy. "Let me go, please." "Jake, what's going on?" the bald guy grumbled. "I know it's your night, but there's only one girl for everyone. Or do you want a private dance and we're screwed?" The blonde was about to answer something, but then in the VIP box entered a new-faced blonde with gorgeous forms in a tight scarlet, shiny dress and high platform shoes. "Boys, sorry we're late. Cindy will entertain you now. It's going to be hot," she chirped. "Cindy," the blonde turned to her. "Marco's dancer. Were you expecting someone else?" The blonde smiled, twirling a curl on her finger. "What's going on? Please let me go." Cindy was ready to cry. "Guys, have fun. I'll be right back." The man they called Jake waved to the men and led Cindy out of the VIP box. Behind the velvet drapes that closed behind them, a slow, sensual tune was played and cheers and whistles were heard. Let me go at last, Cindy exclaimed. All right. Just calm down, okay? The blonde raised his hands conciliatorily and even took a half step back. What's wrong with you? Nothing. She folded her arms across her chest. She wanted to cover herself, not because she was cold, but to cover her shoulders, her neck, and all of herself from that piercing gaze. If nothing had happened, you wouldn't be in this situation, Jake grinned. It's just a name mix-up, the girl muttered. Okay. Hey, where are you going? When Cindy tried to sneak out again, now she was lying with her belly across the knees of the guy who had caught her, and her nose was in the knees of the one who looked like a mobster. What a horror. Dan, chill out, came the handsome, deep male voice above her. The next moment Cindy, floundering like a fawn barely learning to walk, was on her feet, supported by strong arms. What's your name? The blonde man asked sternly. Now that he stood up, it was clear that he was much taller than her husband, and to look him in the eyes you have to tilt your head. Cindy. No, Cindy. There's been a mistake. I didn't come this way. I mumbled, trying to pull away, but he wouldn't let me. It was embarrassing, hurtful, and strangely hot around this man. So, you're not? I'm not dancing. Exhaled Cindy. Let me go, please. Jake, what's going on? The bald guy grumbled. I know it's your night, but there's only one girl for everyone. Or do you want a private dance and we're screwed? The blonde was about to answer something, but then in the VIP box entered a new-faced blonde with gorgeous forms in a tight scarlet, shiny dress and high platform shoes. Boys, sorry we're late. Cindy will entertain you now. It's going to be hot, she chirped. Cindy. The blonde turned to her. Marco's dancer? Were you expecting someone else? The blonde smiled, twirling a curl on her finger. What's going on? Please let me go. Cindy was ready to cry. Guys, have fun. I'll be right back. The man they called Jake waved to the men and led Cindy out of the VIP box. Behind the velvet drapes that closed behind them, a slow, sensual tune was played and cheers and whistles were heard. Let me go at last, Cindy exclaimed. All right. Just calm down, okay? The blonde raised his hands conciliatorily and even took a half step back. What's wrong with you? Nothing. She folded her arms across her chest. She wanted to cover herself, not because she was cold, but to cover her shoulders, her neck, and all of herself from that piercing gaze. If nothing had happened, you wouldn't be in this situation, Jake grinned. It's just a name mix-up, the girl muttered. Okay. Hey, where are you going? When Cindy tried to sneak out again, actually, I just picked a normal place to have a little talk, Jake said, and I didn't mean to. So you're the kind of woman who won't let you pay for yourself. What about without the subtext? It's not a date, really? I'm sorry, but I wouldn't be flattered if a woman fainted in front of me. Bowing her head low, Cindy nodded and stomped over next to her. How embarrassing. No, she wasn't the type to pay for herself. If only because it had been a long time since she'd had her own money and her spouse had paid everywhere. She'd heard about this place, fancy, impossibly expensive, and tables booked almost ahead of time. Mr. Wilson, welcome. The receptionist rushed up to them. At last you have honored us with your attention again. You and your lovely companion. The receptionist gave a second-half bow to Cindy, and she gawked. I guess this Jake guy is famous around here. A table where it's quieter, the blonde man threw in. Yes, of course. Would you like a view of the harbor? Jake nodded. They were escorted to a table by the window. It was elegantly set with a fancy, ornate arrangement of live oil. He was born in Alaska. His father was a motorboat repairman, and his mother was a school nurse. Jake graduated from Harvard, becoming a lawyer specializing in international law. He began to build a career in one of the firms in New York, but then on vacation decided to visit these islands and just fell in love with the tropical flavor of local life. He decided to try to find a job here, and he found one. And now for 3 years he has been here, slowly combining, in fact, endless vacation and career. Sounds like a fairy tale, Cindy smiled. From the outside, Jake nodded. But in reality, sometimes I don't leave the office for a week. Today was my day off. And I blew it. Friends can wait, but a damsel in distress can't. I'm not a damsel in distress. Well, then what are we doing here? And by the way, what are you going to do next? We're flying back in 10 days. Do you have a good divorce lawyer? What? I didn't think. Cindy swallowed hard. About divorce. Do you love him? It was a very simple question, and yet unbearably difficult, and even more so when it came from a man she had met under such strange circumstances. It's very personal, Cindy replied. Thank you for buying me dinner. Will you let me walk you out? Cindy nodded. Can I have your number? Don't take this the wrong way, but I think we should still talk about everything. Cindy dictated the number. Everything she had experienced in the last couple of hours was starting to feel like a dream. Too many emotions, and not the most pleasant ones. And then, suddenly, like in a movie, a mysterious stranger gives her a helping hand. Jake paid the bill and walked out of the restaurant. He led her to a car, and although Cindy didn't know the make of the car, she realized it was something very expensive. Said to bring it up from the club parking lot, he explained, opening the front passenger door in front of her. Buckle up. He threw her a stern look, since Cindy didn't do it right away. The fine for not wearing a belt on a passenger is $2,000 plus 12 hours of community service. The passenger pays. The local government is very sensitive to safety issues, and all the deaths that have occurred on the island are believed to attract bad luck to these lands. So they warn them as best they can. Cindy hummed and hurried to buckle herself in. She was glad in her mind that Harvey wasn't going to rent a car here. He had a habit of not wearing his seatbelt and called his wife a coward if she remembered to do so. As they drove up to the hotel, Cindy thought about what would happen if her husband saw her with another man. She'd never given him any such reason until this evening. But when they'd said goodbye to Jake, when she'd gone up to her floor and entered the room, empty as expected, she suddenly realized that it would probably give her a prickly, vindictive pleasure. And then Cindy just wanted to sleep, the dense dinner, and the generally tired body, for which the long flight had only ended the previous morning. She fell asleep as soon as her head What? He gave her a strange look. It's okay, don't start, and he shrugged his shoulders, dropping her hand. Cindy thought with irritation that her husband always managed to ruin every good thing they'd done that seemed to bring their family closer together. And then, involuntarily, it was as if someone had forced into her head the idea that a little trip to a tropical paradise with Jake would have been different. Lucky someone. Sighed Cindy silently about the blonde lover, which of course he already has. Well, all will appear soon. Such men do not stay on the beach for long. Finally, they returned to the beach. The guide offered everyone snacks and soft drinks seized in advance from the main island and waiting for tourists in cooler bags on the boat. The guide caught the hand of an elderly lady, I think she was from Germany, when she wanted to pick up a pebble from the beach as a souvenir. From his hurried speech, Cindy realized that it was forbidden to take the pebbles out of here specifically, doubly threatened with some draconian fine. The German tourist frightenedly returned the stones to their place in the surf. Finally, it was time to go back. What happened? The same German lady got excited as the boat approached the pier where it had originally left. I returned those stones. I don't think that's on you, Cindy reassured her. Well, it's not for all of us. Something serious must have happened. The thing was, there were people on the beach. Cindy didn't know much about it, but they seemed to be local authorities, like the police. The girl opened her eyes and Jake was among them. He was dressed in uniform pants, short safari-style boots, and a beige short-sleeved shirt with some kind of colorful patches. When the boat docked, one of the local law enforcement officers looked into it and quickly spoke to the guide about something. He turned white and turned to his fellow travelers and translated the orders into English. "I need you all to hand over your backpacks and bags. It won't take long. Right now, please." A disgruntled murmur spread through the company of vacationers. "What the hell is this?" Harvey frowned. "They don't have the right." Cindy, who had already handed over her light cotton backpack, in which she carried water, bug spray, and other necessities, smiled reassuringly at him. "Honey, don't worry. It's just a formality." "Why should it be?" Harvey snapped at her and averted his eyes. "Translate that, please." The guide turned to Cindy. "The National Park Rangers have learned that there are poachers on Pirate Island. The island is closed to the public as of today. We were the last ones to arrive. They are checking everyone returning from it. It is suspected that the poachers want to pass something through tourists because visitors to the country are traditionally treated with great trust." Cindy patiently relayed the words to her husband. Harvey continued to frown, but finally held out the backpack. The mustachioed elderly ranger took it and opened it. All the campers except Cindy and her husband were up, but they were still crowded around the backpack, curious to see how it would end. Someone suggested that maybe even the boat would be checked. What if the guide had taken something out? Cindy waited patiently. She was getting a headache again, either from the full blazing sun or from her husband. She didn't immediately realize what was happening next. Just suddenly, the ranger took out a box from her husband's backpack, then another one. He opened it and took out something small, like a toy. One of the tourists, who could see everything better, gasped. "Get out of the boat," the guide said quietly, and looked at Cindy and Harvey with horror, but also with reproach. "But what? I don't understand." The girl looked back at her spouse, Harvey. Mrs. Jake, who had been silent and standing to the side, suddenly turned to her. He was holding out his hand to her now, offering to help her to the shore, but his eyes were cold. Cindy accepted the outstretched hand. Harvey came up next. Now everything could be seen clearly. Some man dressed like a hospital doctor took what looked like a toy, felt it, and ordered another ranger to do something to a very young boy. He rushed to a nearby car and brought a suitcase with a cross on it. Cindy now realized what she was seeing was small, furry monkeys being pulled out of boxes. The tiny creatures were hanging in the hands of the ranger and veterinarian like rags. Cindy shuddered as to how these had gotten into her husband's backpack. Really? The vet was doing something to cover the animal's face with an oxygen mask, something to put into its mouth from a vial. Suddenly, the animal twitched and squeaked. The veterinarian gently intercepted the monkey and put it in the cage brought after the first animal aid suitcase. One of the tourists applauded the rescue of the animals, but in general, everyone was quiet. "Mister, you'll have to come with us," Jake said to Harvey. "It's not mine," he replied, his eyes rounding. "I don't know how it got there." "Mister, you have to come with us," Jake repeated with pressure and turned to Cindy. "Translate to this man, Mrs., that we just want to get to the bottom of this." Cindy spent the next few hours, after her husband, of course, had to get into the ranger's car and drive to their office, in a fog. She didn't see Harvey, who was talking to him in a separate room somewhere, and she was sitting in what appeared to be the reception area. And she couldn't accept reality. Yes, her husband wasn't perfect, but to believe that he would do such a thing was just impossible. "Mrs. Douglas," Jake called her by her husband's last name, "we need to talk. Would you be so kind as to come with me?" The girl nodded and stood up. She followed the blonde man into the office, and judging by its size and the fact that he sat at the desk with no one else there, she assumed he was some kind of boss. "So, I want to hear your side of the story." Jake switched to a more familiar style of speech. "I don't know what happened," the girl said. We were just on a field trip, and Harvey took it this morning. He didn't even ask me. We were walking with the guide all." Cindy blinked, feeling like crying. And then, "I don't know. Harvey would never. Your husband took part in smuggling an endemic species of marmoset." Jake leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and gave the girl across from him a mocking, icy stare. "I doubt they took the sleeping pills themselves, lay in the boxes, and dropped into his backpack like ripe coconuts." Cindy didn't recognize him. The man who was in front of her now looked nothing like the man who had taken care of her so unexpectedly and warmly yesterday. And it was certainly not because he had taken her to a restaurant for nothing, but he had shown ordinary human participation. He had listened to her. He wasn't indifferent. "You don't think?" This sudden realization was frightening and insulting at the same time. "That I'm in on this too?" Jake said, and smiled. "That's an interesting idea. Actually, I had that theory. I even wondered if our meeting yesterday wasn't a coincidence. But on the other hand, you didn't ask me anything about the operation of our parks. You didn't try in any way to gain my special favor." At his last words, Cindy felt her cheeks flush again. "So I think, given what you've been saying about your husband, maybe you had nothing to do with it." "Of course I had nothing to do with it," Cindy exclaimed. "I didn't even know we were going to this island. Your husband didn't buy the tour, by the way. He was given 2 tickets. A woman named Sarah. You know her?" "Yeah," Cindy nodded. She's my husband's mistress. She originally wanted to go to the island herself with someone local, we even suspect with whom. You see, imperial green-eared marmosets are very expensive on the black market. They're caught, put to sleep, packaged like you saw, and tried to smuggle them across the border. More than half, if not 70%, of the animals are killed, but the income from the sale of the rest is enough to cover all the costs and risks. Apparently, Sarah was chosen at random as soon as she arrived on the island. Sometimes the locals, businessmen, work with tourists. It's awful, Cindy said. Harvey, he's been having trouble with money lately, she added deafeningly. Sarah seems to have been scared to go into the business herself. We know for a fact that the man who was supposed to accompany her backed out at the last minute and ordered her to take the monkeys alone. And she, just like that, decided to entrust it to a man who was tempted by the alleged ease of the adventure and the generous reward. Unfortunately, we have already had a similar experience. The airport security service missed the export of several species of butterflies. They were in the caterpillar stage, as well as lizards. In the near future, by the way, we expect to catch poachers. They have been on the island supposedly for 3 months and are simply afraid to return, as they do not know which of the owners of boats carrying tourists can still be trusted. What will happen to my husband? Asked Cindy. I don't know, shrugged Jake. What do you mean? The girl got up from the table. I thought you said you had very strict laws. He's a foreigner. You wouldn't dare. Actually, these very marmosets are on the coat of arms of our ruler. He'll be furious. He'll want to, say, punish someone who's insulted his country. No, Cindy shook her head. There must be something we can do. I don't know. Please. Jake turned away, looking out the window. Last night he was just going to relax with his friends at the club after a busy week. Then this strange tourist practically fell on their heads. Jake couldn't explain the reasons for his own behavior. He just wanted to help this girl, to comfort her, to protect her. He hadn't tried to impress her, and he'd taken her to the restaurant because it was close to the club and had good food. He hadn't tried to seduce her. Only later, when he returned to his apartment in the morning, he thought about the fact that it was unusual for him. After all, it seemed that if he showed a little more persistence, she could be with such a nasty, as she said, her husband, at least a couple of kisses to give. And the girl had been on Jake's mind ever since. And now it was so that he began to make an additional plan to get his own. Jake's good education and natural acumen helped him build a brilliant career in a place where foreigners were treated with a duality of endless hospitality and wariness at the same time. At first, he was a visiting consultant on international law, which was important because the water borders of the small island nation were claimed by many. Then he was offered a permanent position in the National Park Service, of which there were 4, scattered over 4 islands out of the dozen that make up the country. 2 years ago, as a lawyer, Jake had been involved in a successful case in which a neighboring country had paid a large compensation for trespassing by its fishing trawlers, causing great damage to coral reefs. The sole ruler of the island country, who held the title of king like his father and his grandfather before him, had noticed the success of a foreigner so zealous for the natural well-being of the area. And he offered Jake not only a promotion, but also a lot of privileges, as well as simplified citizenship, while other foreigners could get it only for generous investments, for example, for starting a business that would provide jobs for the local population and taxes for the local budget. And now the woman sitting in front of him seemed to be begging him to do anything to save her husband. Jake grinned. The gray-eyed tourist was charming, but not enough to get everything from him just like that. "I can talk to someone," he said as if he didn't care at all. "Maybe your husband will just get off with a fine and being put on some list." "What list?" Cindy didn't understand. The list that could deny him a visa to neighboring island countries, for example. And that's it. The girl was relieved. "This is the first vacation we've taken in years. I don't think it's such a big loss." "The fine will be $50,000, Jake added, watching the girl's reaction carefully. "Plus your husband will be flogged in the main square, along with his mistress. She's under arrest, too." "What?" Cindy now thought her heart might stop on the spot. She couldn't call her husband perfect. She couldn't say Harvey was the man of her life or her favorite person in the world. But still, he was her husband, her family man. And at the thought of what could be done to him, and that money, they could never raise that much money from friends and acquaintances. So what do we do? Sell the apartment? It seemed to Cindy that all the air was gone from the room. She raised her hand, pressed it to her neck, rubbed it nervously, and sighed convulsively. A moment and Jake was sent a pleading look. "Please, isn't there anything we can do? We don't have that kind of money, and you said you were a lawyer. Isn't there anything you can do?" "No, you can't." "What do you mean, you can't do it? It's not gonna happen." Charming panic. The blonde grinned and squinted. "What do you expect me to do? Go to the governor and tell him to forgive the smuggler because his wife needs it. And by the way, why is this so important to you? Isn't this all just retribution for treason? Anybody else in your position would be jumping for joy. Of course, paying the fine is bad enough. It's bad for your well-being too." Cindy was in a foggy haze. She saw Jake in front of her and saw him as her last Cindy. Please shook her head. Tears rolled down the girl's cheeks. Please, just something. I want to see my husband. Don't I have the right to do that? You know, I've already done something. I've talked to someone and assured them that you had nothing to do with it. You like animals, don't you?" "Yeah," Cindy nodded. "I would never." "I believe you. And I'm really sorry that our acquaintance took place and continued under these circumstances. But you know what?" Rising, Jake walked around the table and stopped in front of Cindy, a step away from her, a hard look in his eyes, a slightly lowered tone. "I'll see what else I can do. Let's meet tonight and talk about it, okay? Here." He quickly wrote something on a piece of paper torn from a notebook. "Come to this address at 10 o'clock tonight. And don't talk to the press, it'll be worse for you." The hours to the evening passed swiftly and yet painfully slowly. Cindy spent the rest of the time in her room. She was knocked on twice, once when she ordered room service and the second time when the porter told her that a member of the press wanted to speak to her. But she naturally refused. In the evening, Cindy called a cab and gave her an address. It turned out to be a residential complex in the center of the city, and judging by the serious security at the entrance and the appearance of the building, it was an elite one. The girl was stopped in the lobby and asked who she was, and then nodded, letting her in, clearly alerted to her arrival. Cindy consoled and encouraged herself Jake would definitely help. How could a man who had been so generous and friendly the first time they met do otherwise? He had been rude during the day. He was just on duty, worried about the monkeys. Stepping off the elevator, Cindy stopped at the correct suite number and pressed the bell button. A moment later, the door opened. Jake smiled at her. "Come in." Cindy looked around the apartment without much curiosity. Stone walls, leather furniture, lots of gray shades. It looked expensive, stylish, but it was cold, uncomfortable. "Can I pour you a drink?" a man asked, walking to the bar. "I don't drink, not at all," I replied. "Too bad." He grinned and poured himself some wine. Cindy sighed. She thought it was better not to talk about something so serious, something that was about to happen, not under alcohol. "Sit down," he pointed to the couch. The girl obediently lowered herself onto it. She put her purse on the coffee table with a glass top and folded her hands in her lap. I wanted to ask what he could do, but I choked on my words because Jake was suddenly very close. His hands slid down the back of the couch so that he was, in effect, putting his arm around the girl. "Tell me, how did you two meet? What did he win you over with?" Cindy thought it was rude to demand answers right away, so she decided it was okay to tell him a little more about herself. "You're such a silly girl," Jake grinned, setting down his glass of wine. "You're very pretty, aren't you? You could have found someone better. At least not after he took you." "What are you talking about?" Cindy frowned. "I mean, you think I should have looked for another man after Harvey did so much for me?" This practical, yet extremely cynical suggestion of how things could have been better for her angered the girl to the core. "I'm just saying that a smart woman always knows how to find what's best for her," he shrugged. "I just can't understand how you still love that guy. But, well, I guess there's something you can do in your case. The thing is that before the punishment, he will have to be examined by a doctor, and he may find out that your husband, for example, has a heart problem. Does he have that?" "Actually, he's healthy," Cindy thought, remembering. "In such a case, the doctor can still say that it is impossible to punish the ruler, does not need that. Instead of a show flogging, there was an execution with the death of a tourist. It would be such a scandal, would spoil the image of the country." Cindy didn't say that such an execution was hardly good for the country's image. Right now, she clung to Jake's option with all her strength, all her hope. "Can you do it?" she asked, reaching out and grabbing his hand. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully, and covered her slender, cold fingers with his hand, lightly stroking them. "As for the fine, in principle, you could borrow it, and then, when it works out, you could pay it back. But I have no acquaintance who could so easily borrow $50,000 and wait. I can." "What?" She froze, frozen, looking at Jake. His words should have been encouraging, reassuring, but along with that, Cindy began to realize something, or rather, she began to have some suspicions. Jake was so close. He had met her here at his place and late last night. The only question was, he was so close that she could feel his hot breath on her face. "What are you willing to do to save your husband?" Cindy felt like she'd been split in two. One was horrified at what an abomination, what a dirty deal she was being offered. But on the other side of the scale was her Harvey. And the other part of the girl, the more subconscious part, was crushed by the bitter realization that behind the attractive mask of this man was just a monster. Just a low man who had found a way to satisfy his desires no matter what. Against all odds, Cindy exhaled and moved forward, drawing Jake into the kiss. This night she tried not to meet his gaze because it hurt too much. This night she was just doing everything she could to save her husband. And she hoped she wouldn't be deceived. A week later, it was reported that 2 poachers had been captured on Pirate Island. In all those days, Cindy met with Jake many times, and not just for small talk. "Excuse me, Cindy Douglas?" A voice behind her made her flinch. Cindy was out for a stroll, just to walk the streets, maybe sit on the beach for a while. She was unfamiliar with this woman in her 40s, short haircut, red-haired, light scarf over her head, eyes hidden behind dark glasses as if to protect her from the sun, but for some reason it seemed to be a kind of disguise. "You don't know me," the stranger smiled. "My name is Anna Colon. I'm a journalist." "Oh no." Cindy waved her arms and not very politely elbowed her way out of the crowd at the souvenir shop. "No interviews." "No, you misunderstood me." A member of the press came rushing after her. "I'm sorry for scaring you. I'm not here to question you about what happened to your husband. I want to help. I don't think you can help me." "You never know." Anna looked around. "Why don't we sit down? We really need to talk. I need to warn you about Jake." The mention of the man who essentially held her husband's fate in his hands made Cindy give up running. The girl tensed up, looked around too, not realizing anyone might be following them. She finally agreed. They sat down at a plastic table in a simple cafe, ordered a glass of lemonade. "So, what do you want?" Cindy said, tapping her sneaker nervously on the sidewalk. "I know you've been seeing Jake Wilson lately. He's working on a case my husband's involved in. You've been meeting informally. You go to his house. Is that how Rangers do business now?" Cindy, flushed with shame, turned away. "It's none of your business. Jake Wilson is one of the most corrupt officials in this city and this country. He skims the cream off everything he can get his hands on. He's got the power, and he's good at pulling the strings." "I don't know what you're talking about." Cindy wanted to jump up, put her hands over her ears and run away. She'd already realized that Jake wasn't one of the good guys, but actually, she didn't care what was going on, just as long as she could get Harvey out, just as long as she could get home. As far as the universe was concerned, she'd never go on another trip overseas again in her life. "You are in a difficult situation, and it is not for me to judge a woman who is trying to save her husband," Anna said. "All I know is that this could end badly. Are you sure Jake will keep his promises?" "I'm not." Anna was having trouble breathing again. She drained the glass of lemonade, but she felt neither the taste nor the refreshing satisfaction. "I don't know. I want to save my husband." "What about having, shall we say, a backup? A leverage against a man who, you realize, doesn't have a penny of conscience? Wouldn't you like to help other people? Those who might still be victimized by him in the future? Bribes, blackmail. Believe me, this man has achieved a lot, and he's not going to stop. They say he's a dictator. Oh, I misspoke. The local ruler is willing to give him the daughter of one of his concubines, which will certainly add to Jake's influence. But we, you and I, can stop it all." "I don't understand you." Cindy shook her head. She could believe what she was hearing, but the journalist's confidence that they could change everything seemed absurd. What could 2 women, and even foreigners, do here? Anna just held it out to her, showing her an ID card from some French magazine. "Just listen to me," Anna said. "Then, of course, you can think about it. Just understand that we don't have much time and you, as a brave woman, can influence a lot of things." Cindy listened to her unexpected ally. What she was proposing seemed insane, but there was no alternative. Cindy agreed. Anna clearly explained to her what had to be done and made her repeat the whole plan 100 times. Everything was to take place at the last meeting with Jake. The next day, the ruler of the country was to decide personally what would be the fate of the tourists who had sullied themselves by their ungrateful attitude to the tropical land that had welcomed them. That evening, and part of the night Cindy spent at Jake's apartment. She chose the moment when he went to pick up a dinner delivered from the restaurant, which she had no appetite for. And when he returned, she spoke. She called him by name and found occasion to mention his surname. She said that she was grateful to him for using his power to trick her into saving her husband. She also said that she realized he had, in fact, forced her. But did she have a way out, a way to refuse such a powerful man? Cindy tried to get Jake to talk about what else he was doing, in terms of how he was still breaking the rules of the country where he was building his career so successfully. But he soon got bored of her chatter. The girl left as usual in the early morning and returned to the hotel by cab. The local ruler, a heavy, stunted man whose appearance was a bizarre combination of European costume and local traditional jewelry, replete with gold and precious stones, including a crown and rings, made a heartfelt speech on local television that he was happy that at last another corner of nature was cleared of criminals. He also announced that from now on the country will have to intensify its conservation measures due to the immoral behavior of the two tourists who had been so warmly welcomed. The governor said that Sarah had escaped the lashes because she was a woman, and Harvey would not be punished because he had a weak heart. The fine, however, was not waived for Sarah, and she was to remain on the island until she could find the means to do so. And for Harvey, the fine was paid and he could leave the country, and he had to. "Hi," Cindy said to her husband. From the moment they got off the boat, they met. In just an hour, the couple would be taken under guard to the airport to be officially escorted out of the country, so to speak. But now there was one more formality. Cindy and Harvey had to appear in person before the ruler of the island, and they had to kneel down and formally apologize. Each of them had been met in advance by a man from the palace, who had taught them the ritual phrases of apology in the local language, which, by the way, were not so difficult to memorize. Anna warned Cindy that everything would take place behind the closed doors of the ceremonial hall, where only the ruler and his guards would be present. She assured her that this was the perfect and only possible moment to carry out the plan. Cindy's tears came to her eyes and her heart ached when she saw her husband. She wanted to rush over to him. He was there, he was all right, but she, even though he had cheated on her willingly and openly, she felt that she had no right to do so. It was like she was dirty. Harvey gustily embraced his wife. "My darling." He was naturally unaware of the way he had gotten his freedom, and Cindy had sworn to keep that secret to herself forever. "It's all right. I'll be home soon." "What the hell are those bastards up to?" He frowned, speaking in a low voice and glancing at the guards around him. "Quiet, please." Cindy was afraid that something would happen for saying that. "Please, just say what you've memorized." Finally, the tall gilded doors swung open before them. But stepping over the threshold, Cindy almost shrieked because at the right hand of the ruler stood Jake. What is he doing here? Anna had said that the ceremonial protocol excluded any outsiders. Wasn't this a sign of fate to back off? But when she looked at Jake's face and saw the sneer on it, the contempt for her husband, and probably for her as well, she changed her mind. No, she would do it right, and then watch some more as he would be so strong and all-powerful. Cindy hadn't thought about what the ruler would do to a man who, in fact, for his own purposes, took dirty advantage of power and trust. But it would definitely be something bad, and she didn't feel sorry for Jake, not one bit. She and her husband walked to the throne and knelt before it. They lowered their heads and said a few phrases. Yes, it was a little clumsy, but foreigners are forgiven. Now they were supposed to stand up and walk out without looking up. Cindy took a deep breath. It was time. It was now or never. "Your Majesty, pardon me and let me speak." The guards reacted instantly, alerted and surrounded in a tight ring. In general, some of the guards of the ruler were modern, and some were as if they came from the Middle Ages, in national long motley suits with curved swords on their belts and with spears decorated with feathers. "What are you doing?" The husband stared at the girl in shock and incomprehension. "We've been released already. I'm doing what I have to do, trust me." Cindy told him and turned back to the island's ruler. "I have something very important to tell you. It's about the safety of your power." The ruler frowned and gestured for the guards to stand down. "What do you want? Can we talk in private?" Cindy pleaded with him. "I swear, what I have to say is very important." "What's going on? What are you talking about?" Harvey panicked. His wife was speaking to the governor in English, and he, not understanding a word, was just afraid she'd say too much. They'd be punished again, somehow in this wild country. Jake leaned toward the king and whispered something to him. Cindy's heart sank uneasily, and nothing would work. But then the king made another gesture to the servant, and he said something to the servant, who scurried away. "You are allowed to speak," said the island master to Cindy, "but you will speak to me and in front of my counselor. Mr. Wilson has done much for the welfare of the island. I have no secrets from him." Cindy nodded. Maybe that's even better. He wouldn't understand a word of it, of course, but she could explain it to him later. And in general, she would be able to tell only part of the truth. Another person came into the room, a woman in a purple suit. "You will speak in front of your husband. What the wife says should not be a secret to the husband. It is the will of the gods," said the ruler sternly. "I know that he speaks neither the language of my people nor the English that you and I understand. Every word will be translated with her help." He nodded at the woman in the suit. "She is a good translator and speaks yours among other languages. Speak." Cindy broke into a cold sweat. No. It would be revealed to her husband now. It was. She wasn't prepared for this at all, but it was too late to back down. Holding herself from a shattering tantrum with the mere thought that it would destroy Jake, she pulled her cell phone out of her purse and held it out to the ruler. "Your Majesty, here is a recording of my conversation with your counselor. Please turn it on now." The governor raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Jake gritted his teeth, turned white, and sent Cindy a searing glare. The girl was afraid he might try to knock the phone out of the king's hands altogether, to stop him somehow. But he didn't act. Didn't expect this? The bastard. Did he realize it was all over for him? The king said something to a servant who handed him and the interpreter headphones. Cindy understood why he wanted to listen in the original, and the guest specialist needed them to do simultaneous translation for her husband without interrupting one sound. What a nightmare. Harvey was about to open his mouth to demand an explanation, but then he just listened. Cindy wasn't looking at anyone. She was staring at the floor. It was unbearable. The girl cautiously took a step, another step away from her husband. He will forgive her, won't he? She thought, and it seemed so strange to want to cry, and at the same time as if there were no tears. "Oh, you bitch," bellowed her husband as the tape ended. Cindy shrieked, but her husband, who rushed to her, was held back by the guards who crossed his path with spade sticks. With her husband alive, she's going to another man's bunk. "Harvey, I was saving you," Cindy exclaimed. "Didn't you hear me?" "I heard that you told him." Harvey shook his hand and pointed at Jake. "You sang about what a man he was and how good it was for you." Cindy stepped toward her husband, not afraid of him at all. "I'm sorry, I just wanted tow." "Mrs. Douglas." The king's voice was menacing. Rising from his throne, he confidently, stamping his step, approached the tourists. "Just because you gave me this tape, what did you expect?" The king's face suddenly broke into a smile. Cindy blinked incomprehensibly. "You found out that your counselor and the man you gave power to, Jake Wilson is a loyal man," said the governor. "I value him, and his personal life is on his conscience." Personal life? Cindy couldn't believe what she was hearing. "He told the doctor to forge my husband's health certificate. He's taking bribes. He swindled poachers' boats off the coral reefs. And for the latter we are immensely grateful to him. The governor grinned. It has supported the treasury considerably. And bribery, well, it's certainly not the best way to do business, but his other virtues more than cover it. As for you, you obviously didn't come up with this on your own, did you? Not long ago, you were seen with a hotshot journalist, Anna Colon. I suppose it was her idea. It's all right, the secret police are already on it. You're the king. You're supposed to protect justice. They call you the leopard in gold, the 1,000-year guardian of the island. Cindy couldn't believe it was real. You foreigners are so fond of prying. The king shook his head. Sometimes I think opening up the country was a bad idea in the first place. But you, Mrs. Douglas, are forgiven. Jake has some sympathy for you, and so I forgive your impertinence. As for you, the governor approached the counselor and gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder. You should be more careful. Perhaps marriage will be good for you. And deal with Anna. She and her colleagues have too much to offer. I'd bow to your will, my king. Jake bowed. He stepped down from the throne and approached Cindy. I thought you were smarter than that. Were we so bad together that you decided to betray us? Perhaps he suddenly grasped her chin with one hand and her waist with the other and pulled her toward him. Your husband doesn't think you're a fool for nothing. When he said that, he kissed her lips. Farewell, passionate, even desperate, but without a shadow of tenderness. He let her go. Escort these tourists to the airport and be polite. We respect visitors to the island, even if they don't pay us the same, Jake said. Cindy walked out of the palace as if in a fog. She was not well aware of what was going on around her. The car she and her husband sat in the back seat, but they didn't even look at each other. The airport. Here they began to stare at them. Journalists clicked cameras. The accompanying guards hurriedly took the spouses to one of the luxury lounges until the time of their departure, freed from outsiders. Finally, boarding was announced. Harvey. Cindy turned to her husband as the plane gained altitude and the islands and ocean began to look like a blurred watercolor. Her husband didn't answer. He turned away toward the aisle between the seats. In the past, when they fought, Harvey usually talked a lot. Then he would just walk away, as he explained once, to get some air. But never had he been so silent. Can I have a glass of juice? Apple. If you have it, Cindy asked the stewardess, who had just shown up at their row with a table on wheels. Yes, please. How was your vacation? Tropical islands are unforgettable, aren't they? With a sincere smile, designed to prolong the aftertaste of a marvelous tourist trip, the stewardess turned to her, filling a glass and handing her a drink. Yes, it's one you won't forget, Cindy replied. There must have been something in her gaze, after which the stewardess somehow got cold feet and realized that it was not necessary to get involved with people who had problems. The plane landed for a connection in London, then flew home. At the airport of her hometown, Cindy was worried about how quickly the news about what had happened could become known to her family. In general, of course, all they can find out is that Harvey was caught as a smuggler, nothing more. But they'll know for sure, even if it doesn't make it on TV. The story could be revealed on the internet. Plus, Sarah is left on the islands and unfortunately, she and their family have mutual acquaintances. Harvey, we need to talk. Cindy ventured once more to her own man. There's nothing to talk about, he muttered. Leave me alone. He waved her off. We live as we used to live. But living as before, of course, did not work out. Harvey's colleagues at work were the first to know about it, because Sarah never came back from vacation. The fuss began. Almost immediately, all of the Douglas entourage learned about what Harvey had done. His parents had a heart condition, and it was all true. Cindy, no matter how she felt about her husband, had been on good terms with his father and mother during their marriage and sympathized with them sincerely. Naturally, she and her husband had questions about how they got out. Cindy stubbornly repeated yes, her husband had health problems. Yes, the fine was paid by local charitable organizations, but they asked not to be identified so they wouldn't be flooded with requests. It was about 2 weeks after her return when it became known that Sarah had paid about a third of the fine and was finally released from the island with the obligation to continue paying. She was fired from her job, and although the chief told everyone that she had simply stopped coping with her duties, his true opinion was also known. He didn't want to have a person on his staff who was involved in such a serious illegal case. Cindy and Harvey hardly spoke. All their communication was limited to the essentials. They no longer slept together. Her husband began to make his own bed in the hall. Cindy tried several more times to talk to him about everything that had happened. After all, it couldn't go on like this forever. But he waved it off, said he had to think. And then, 3 months after his return, he simply said he was filing for divorce. "I can't do this," he said, looking into Cindy's eyes. "You know, I can't do it. Yeah, I cheated on you myself. It's like I'm crazy. But you, and I was just trying to save you." The girl grinned bitterly. "And still, you shouldn't have done that. You betrayed me by lying with someone else." Her husband threw angrily. "Pack your things. Rent an apartment for yourself or something. We do not share property is not much, only the savings account. I'm a fool. I should have kept the money with my parents." "I'm not asking for anything," Cindy replied. "I'm not offering you anything," Harvey said. "There's not much there anyway. Enough to get you back to your hole. Or are you going to stay here in town? You'll find someone. You're experienced now. Did you really like it with him that much?" Cindy's hand flew up and landed on the man's cheek. Harvey groaned and stared at her incomprehensibly. There had been a lot of bad blood between the couple, but he'd never laid a hand on his wife. "Don't you ever talk to me like that again," Cindy said. She was calm outwardly, and inwardly. She was no longer tormented by the pain of betrayal or resentment or anything. It was as if everything inside had burned out. "And what I will do, how to live on, is not your concern." When the divorce was finalized, the girl packed her things. It turned out there wasn't much of it. Cindy didn't deny her pride, but she realized how stupid it would be to leave her husband's house with nothing at all, so she accepted the amount she was entitled to from the account where her husband saved from each paycheck. In addition, Cindy realized it was a fair, albeit insufficient, compensation for agreeing to sell her own apartment early in the marriage. She had rented an apartment in the same city, a small studio in a bedroom community. Few mutual acquaintances understood this breakup, because before that they seemed to be a perfect couple. Many former mutual friends stopped talking to Cindy, and she was not surprised because they had considered her a shadow for so long, a kind of an appendix to Harvey. The amount in the account was enough to live without worrying about finding an income for about 4 or 5 months. But Cindy decided that it was more reasonable to save more money. Naturally, her lack of education and work experience didn't make her attractive at job interviews, and a couple of places pointed her out the door after the HR department asked her how her family's reputation was. No priors. Cindy was confused. She answered honestly yes, there was a story with the ex-husband. "I'm sorry," said Cindy, squeamishly, to the human resources manager at the store where she was applying for a sales job. "But we don't need that kind of people. This is a decent place." But eventually she got a job in a small bakery near her home, and on weekends she began to attend courses to become, as she had wanted once, now it seemed 100 years ago, a master of nail service. The new craft was not easy, but a year later, Cindy was already working in a salon and had her own regular clients who appreciated her signature style of nail design. But the girl was not discouraged. For the first time she felt so free. She tried not to think about her past. Sometimes she even thought that it would not be bad, as it happens in the movies, to get amnesia. Then, perhaps, the nightmares would stop tormenting her, in which Cindy dreamed of a jungle in flames, from which she had to rescue herself and carry a whole bunch of marmoset monkeys. "My me soon to the sea will take me to the sea," once shared with her joy one of the clients. "Anniversary, we have a daughter, there, went to the institute. Well, decided to treat themselves." And then the client named the very islands where Cindy had been. The girl shuddered and almost ruined the client's nail painting. "And you were there." She didn't even notice the change of mood of the masters, so immersed in her own anticipation of the vacation. "Yes, once," Cindy smiled politely. "How was it?" The client fidgeted impatiently. "They say it's magical, and a real king rules there. It's exotic. I wish I could see everything up close." "Believe me, not everything is as beautiful as it seems," sighed Cindy. "Well," the client sighed and pouted. "You're just saying that because you probably got a bad tour operator and the wrong hotel." Another year and a half passed. Cindy was making great progress. Gradually, she began to understand not only how to care for her nails, but also how to perfectly care for the skin on her hands and rejuvenate it. Salon owner Sabrina took notice of the hard-working, talented employee, and one day she called Cindy in for a serious talk. It turned out that she was going to open a second salon and needed an administrator. It was a bright prospect. Cindy only feared that her husband's past might get in the way. So she told her honestly that Harvey had been involved in poaching on a remote island, but she hadn't been personally accused of anything. "I don't care about that," Sabrina said. "You're very talented. I don't care what your ex-husband was up to." After her new position, Cindy's life changed for the better, and soon she decided to take out a mortgage and move out of her rented apartment. Now, if the weather was nice, she liked to go out on the balcony of her new little apartment and have a cup of coffee, watching the dawn splendidly coloring the city that was just beginning to awaken. "Have you forgotten your husband?" A former relative, whom Cindy called periodically, once asked her. "What are you talking about? We've been strangers for a long time." "It's just that," the relative mumbled, but then she continued. "Harvey and I got together. He fell in love. And she tricked him. Well, she tricked him for money. He got depressed. They broke up, and he keeps thinking about you. He says you are special, and he didn't appreciate you. Anyway, maybe you should try again. After all these years of marriage." "No," Cindy said. "We're never gonna be together again. And we probably never should have gotten together in the first place." "You're weird," the relative ranted. "Harvey's a great guy. Hard-working, no bad habits. He won't be alone for long, you know." "You know," Cindy sighed. "I gotta go. I've got things to do," and she hung up. She had no doubt in her mind that there was no future with Harvey. Cindy also sometimes feared that she wouldn't have a life at all, but then she consoled herself that she could live without it because she was doing so well. She's got a job she loves, an apartment of her own. She's strong and independent, just like she dreamed. "Come back to us again. You are our most frequent customer," smiled Cindy at the slender blonde who was just getting up from her chair, admiring her new scarlet manicure. "You're the best," smiled back at Ariana. "Tony will be shocked. He says I'm too bright, like a butterfly." Cindy sighed. Ariana was only talking about it. Dinka. She seemed to be very happy. "When you marry your treasure, for the wedding look only to us." She winked at the girl. "What?" Ariana rounded her eyes. "Wow, you thought Tony was my boyfriend, didn't you?" "No," asked Cindy cautiously. "Oh, you probably thought that because I talk about him all the time," laughed Ariana. "No, Tony is my big brother. And that's even better than a boyfriend," said Cindy. "A boyfriend can leave, but a brother will always be." "That he is. He promised he'd pick him up and that we'd go to the zoo together." Ariana picked up her purse, paid quickly, and raced to the entrance of the salon, where a tall brunette man of about 35 years old had just appeared. "What, a new look again?" He gently hugged his little sister. Do they feed you cakes with bonuses that you come here all the time? Joker. Ariana poked him lightly in the side. You don't know anything about women's fashion. Here, meet the queen of the Salon Nadezhda. Hello. Cindy smiled politely at the brunette and extended her hand. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. The handshake was strong, but neat. A minute later, Tony and Ariana left. The next day, Tony came to the salon and immediately, without any long preamble, asked Cindy out on a date. The girl was shocked. What kind of proposal is that? I'm not saying it was love at first sight, but I just thought I'd make a quick first move before someone else did. I'm afraid such a charming businesswoman doesn't lack suitors. I don't need admirers at all, Cindy replied, embarrassed, and tried to look as nonchalant and disinterested as possible. And I don't go on dates that easily. Good. Let's make it complicated. Whatever you like. The masters in the hall, as well as some of the clients, have their ears perked up. You're not just kicking them out, are you? Tony waved his hands. All right, Cindy blushed. I'll buy you a cup of coffee. There's a place near here. And as it happened, the first date was followed by a second, and then another, and another, and another. Tony wasn't trying to wow Cindy or impress her, although he had opportunities. The guy owned a couple of auto repair shops. They just met somewhere for a cup of tea or coffee to talk about everything. Sometimes they went for a walk in the park. Once they visited a skating rink and an art gallery. It turned out that they had many common interests. Looking back later, Cindy could not understand at what point it turned from an innocent infatuation into a romance. But it did. And one beautiful, really beautiful, clear and warm May day, Tony proposed to her. I've been married before, Cindy said, pulling her hands away and hiding them behind her back. And I've never been married. Look, I don't know who hurt you. I just feel sorry for the man who couldn't see the miracle in front of him. But I can promise you that I'll do everything I can to make our family happy. Do you believe me? Cindy realized that this was a turning point in her life. She could keep looking back on the past, let it rule her, or she could just push it away, lock it behind doors, and throw the key to them in her imagination far, far away into the ocean. She stopped hiding her hands behind her back. She stepped closer to Tony. She looked into his eyes. I believe you. I want us to have a family. I want us to spend every day together. And I'll do my best to make us happy too. And if one day we have a hard time, we'll support and understand each other, won't we? Right? Tony smiled and kissed her tenderly. They were standing in the park and the trees, dressed in spring blossoms, were dropping petals on them under the gusts of light wind.